3 little sisters disappeared into the woods with their father. 5 days later, their lifeless bodies were found near a remote campground. Their father? Still missing. The question that still haunts investigators: did he kill them, or did something darker follow them into the forest? This is one of the most heartbreaking and disturbing unsolved cases in America today. Stay with me till the end as we explore every twist, every theory, and every hidden truth. And if you're listening in the dark, you might want to leave a light on. The Decker family had once been the kind that filled photo frames on the walls of quiet suburban homes, smiling parents, 3 laughing daughters, and the kind of balance that made strangers admire them from afar. Travis Decker, a former high school teacher turned freelance contractor, was known as a soft-spoken man with a quiet confidence, always seen walking his daughters to school, carrying backpacks and ponytail hairbands in his hands like treasures. Emily, the oldest at 9, had a bookish calm about her, often lost in fairy tales and drawing journals. Lily, 8, was the talkative one, always asking questions about the world. And Rose, 5, was the shadow that followed her sisters, always watching, always quiet. The marriage had ended in silence. No screaming matches, no police calls, no visible scars. Just distance that grew over time. After 10 years, Sarah Decker moved back to her hometown with the girls, while Travis rented a small place just across the state line in Washington. The court granted him visitation every other weekend. He rarely missed a single one. He would drive through the night, pick up the girls from school, and whisk them away into the wilderness where cell signals faded and the noise of the world couldn't reach them. On May 30th, 2025, Travis arrived right on time, just like always. He greeted Sarah at the door with a nod, exchanged polite words, and then led the girls to the back of his old blue SUV. It was loaded with sleeping bags, fishing poles, and marshmallows. The plan was to spend the weekend at DePaul Campground, nestled deep in the Olympic National Forest, a spot Travis had been going to since his own childhood. It was remote but legal, with a dozen marked tent sites and a ranger station 3 miles out. The weather forecast showed clear skies. Nothing seemed off. Sarah watched the SUV disappear down the road, unaware that it would be the last time she would see her daughters alive. For 3 days, there was no reason to worry. Travis had warned he might go off-grid, that the signal would be bad. On the 4th day, when Monday morning came and the girls didn't show up for school, Sarah called. The call went to voicemail. By noon, she drove to Travis's apartment. He wasn't home. His phone rang and rang. The SUV wasn't in the parking lot. The missing persons report was filed by late afternoon. Police contacted park rangers and activated search and rescue. Volunteers were dispatched by dawn the next morning. The campground was quiet. No tent. No fire pit. No sign of a struggle. Just an empty clearing, tire tracks in dry dirt, and a soft wind that carried no scent, no sound. On June 2, 2025, 2 searchers following a game trail near an overgrown ravine noticed an unusual concentration of flies circling low. As they approached, the smell became unbearable. There, nestled beneath a fallen log, lay the bodies of the Decker girls, lying side by side, arms by their sides, eyes closed. Their skin was pale. There were no bruises, no blood. Their expressions were peaceful. Post-mortem analysis later confirmed the cause of death: asphyxiation. Each child had been suffocated, most likely by hand. About 2 feet from Emily's body, investigators found a thin smear of blood on a flat rock. DNA confirmed it belonged to Travis Decker. But there was no sign of him, no body, no footprints, no notes. Only his blood, the presence of his daughters, and silence. Authorities treated him as a suspect immediately. Media outlets ran headlines that painted him as an unhinged father who'd snapped under emotional strain. Some shows speculated it was a murder-suicide gone wrong. Others hinted at deeper psychological issues. Yet the evidence was incomplete. There were no signs of trauma on the children that indicated a violent struggle. No fingerprints or alternate DNA. No vehicle found. No camp gear. The deeper investigators looked, the more questions surfaced. Travis had withdrawn a modest sum of cash days before the trip, far less than needed to run or disappear. His laptop history showed no searches for wilderness survival or off-grid living. And then there was the voicemail, a message Sarah had received but never opened until the police asked her to check her inbox. Sent just after 2:30 a.m. on May 31st, it was 6 seconds long. Heavy breathing. Wind. Then Travis's voice, whispering, "They're watching us. I think we're being followed." The audio was sent for forensic cleaning. No other voices were detected. No GPS data attached. No second message followed. After that night, Travis Decker vanished completely. His phone was never turned back on. His bank account remained untouched. The SUV was never found. The police released his name and photo to the public. Billboards went up. Tips came in, but none panned out. Some claimed to have seen him hitchhiking. One trucker swore he'd picked up a man who cried in his sleep. Another said they saw someone matching his description staring at a tree in silence off Highway 12. All led to dead ends. And 3 little coffins were lowered into the ground on June 6, 2025, while the man who once carried them on his shoulders became a ghost himself. In the weeks following the discovery of the Decker girls' bodies, the town of Oceanview found itself frozen in a state of quiet disbelief. The tragedy wasn't just horrifying, it was personal. Everyone knew someone who knew the Deckers. The school hallways fell silent. Teachers skipped over empty seats. Local churches filled with whispered prayers and unanswered questions. What had once been a simple custody arrangement now felt like the front page of a mystery no one could explain. Investigators expanded their search perimeter by miles, deploying K-9 units, drones, and thermal imaging to comb the rugged forests surrounding DePault campground. Nothing turned up. No discarded clothing, no fresh fire pits, not even a scrap of the camping gear that Travis had supposedly packed. Surveillance footage from nearby highways was reviewed frame by frame. There was no image of the blue SUV exiting the park, no sighting on roads in or out after May 30th. It was as if Travis Decker had driven into the woods and evaporated. With pressure mounting from the media, authorities began reconstructing the final days leading up to the disappearance. They traced Travis's last financial transactions, one gas station fill-up, one grocery store receipt listing juice boxes, apples, trail mix, and marshmallows. The clerk remembered the girls, said they were cheerful, laughing, excited to go camping. Travis paid in cash, exchanged polite words, and left. Nothing strange. No signs of agitation. No suggestion of mental breakdown. Sarah Decker was questioned multiple times. Her accounts never wavered. She insisted that Travis had shown no signs of instability. He loved his daughters. He would never hurt them. And yet, there were undercurrents the police didn't ignore. She admitted they hadn't spoken deeply in months. All communication was strictly logistical. She knew little about his day-to-day life, and his emotional world had become increasingly closed off since the divorce. The idea that Travis may have snapped wasn't just convenient, it was statistically probable. Family annihilators often follow a pattern, a loss of identity, isolation, an increasing sense of despair. But the Decker case didn't quite fit. There was no manifesto, no suicide note, no history of violence or instability. And the bodies of the girls were handled with an eerie tenderness. They had been placed, not discarded. Arranged, not buried. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit joined the case after 2 weeks of stagnant leads. Their profile was cautious but deliberate. They did not believe this was a spontaneous act of rage. The placement of the bodies, the absence of weapons, and the lack of digital planning all hinted at something else, possibly premeditated, but with no clear motive. They began to entertain another theory, that Travis was not the killer, but a victim himself. The blood found near the bodies did belong to Travis, but it was minimal. A single smear. Enough to raise questions but not enough to confirm fatal injury. Forensic testing showed that the blood was mixed with a foreign soil compound not native to DePault campground. This discovery opened a new angle. Perhaps the site where the girls were found wasn't the site of the murders. Perhaps they had been moved. Satellite imagery from May 31st was inconclusive. Cloud cover obscured the forest. But earlier images did show a dirt road near the eastern ridge that had not existed on maps. Investigators sent a team to explore it. What they found was a narrow path leading to a long-abandoned ranger outpost, collapsed roof, broken glass, rusted tools. On one wall inside the structure, they discovered a hand-drawn smiley face scratched into the wood. Beneath it, the date May 30th, 25 and the letters T and R. The initials raised alarms. T for Travis. R for Rose? Rachel? Richard? No other names in the family matched. For weeks, no one could determine the meaning. It was dismissed as graffiti until a retired forest worker contacted the police. He remembered the outpost. He had sealed it himself in the late 1990s after reports of strange activity. Lights in the trees. Campers hearing voices. A missing hiker who'd left behind only his boots. The case files were unearthed. None had ever been solved. All were dismissed as folklore or coincidence. But the similarities were enough to make the hair on the back of an agent's neck rise. What if Travis hadn't gone mad? What if something else had happened out there, something they couldn't see? That was when the phone call came in. A ranger station 40 miles west of the campground reported something strange. A man had approached the ranger station barefoot, soaked to the skin, and incoherent. He muttered about the children and they're still watching. Before the ranger could react, the man bolted into the trees and vanished. He left behind only a strip of blue cloth, similar in color to the shirt Travis had last been seen wearing. DNA tests were inconclusive. The cloth was too weathered. No fingerprints. No fibers. Just another dead end. But rumors had started to spread. About the old woods. About missing people. About symbols found carved into tree trunks and the sound of children crying at night. And beneath it all, the chilling, unresolved question, if Travis Decker didn't kill his daughters, then who did? As days turned into weeks, public opinion began to fracture. Online forums, podcasts, and late-night television shows latched onto the Decker case like vultures circling a mystery that refused to die. One side painted Travis Decker as a grieving father who had either died alongside his daughters or been taken against his will. The other side sharpened their theories with cold conviction. Travis was alive, on the run, and guilty. The media ran wild with speculation. Was this a case of filicide masked as disappearance? Or had a deeper, more disturbing force swallowed the family whole? Every headline added fuel to the chaos. Father or fugitive? Ghosts in the forest? 3 little graves and no answers. The speculation intensified when a small YouTube channel claimed to have captured drone footage of a man matching Travis's description walking alone near the ridgeline 5 days after the girls' bodies were found. The footage was grainy, unclear, and ultimately unverifiable, but it went viral overnight. Federal investigators couldn't ignore the public reaction. With pressure from higher authorities, they reopened several cold cases in the same region that involved missing campers, hikers, and solitary travelers, most notably, a pair of twin brothers who vanished in 2012 and were never found, and a high school teacher who went missing during a solo trail run in 2018. In each case, there was a familiar pattern: people entered the woods, made contact with loved ones, then vanished without a trace. The only commonality among them was their proximity to what locals now called the Black Hollow, a name unofficially given to the dense, gnarled stretch of wilderness near the DePault campground. While officials never formally acknowledged the connection, off-the-record sources admitted the pattern was hard to dismiss. Something about that region swallowed people whole. Search and rescue teams reported odd compass malfunctions, sudden fog banks, and whispers in the trees they couldn't trace. Superstition crept into briefings. Crews began refusing night shifts in certain sectors. Some claimed they heard children laughing far beyond the line of sight, laughter that stopped the moment flashlights swept the dark. Meanwhile, forensic teams continued poring over the evidence collected from the girls' bodies and the immediate area. Trace elements of calcium carbonate were found in Rachel Decker's hair, a mineral not native to the forest soil but commonly found in old cemeteries and limestone caves. This detail, buried in a sea of data, led to a renewed investigation into the region's old mines, many of which had been sealed off decades ago due to dangerous conditions and geological instability. One such site, Red Elk Mine, had a particularly grim reputation. It had collapsed in 1971, trapping a crew of workers inside. Their bodies were never recovered. Permission was granted to break the seal on Red Elk for exploration. What the team found wasn't evidence of human habitation, but something worse. Carvings. Symbols. Primitive in design, etched into the stone with tools or fingernails. Circles intersected with jagged lines. The same smiley face found in the abandoned ranger station appeared again, only this time, it was repeated dozens of times along the tunnel walls. There were no footprints, no human remains, no signs that anyone had lived or died there recently. But the air in the mine was inexplicably colder than the ambient temperature should allow. One member of the team reported hearing a voice call her name from inside the rock wall. She never returned to work after that day. Still, investigators refused to go on record with anything they couldn't prove. The public wanted answers grounded in science, not campfire horror stories. Yet every lead pointed to nothing verifiable, only strange dead ends and atmospheric anomalies that defied measurement. Analysts studying the Decker case files began to quietly suggest the existence of what they called a zone of interruption, a space where logic, technology, and time itself became unreliable. While this wasn't an official term, it began circulating among interagency memos and team discussions. Then came another twist. A security camera from a truck stop 112 miles from the campground picked up a man who looked like Travis Decker. He was disheveled, bearded, with a limp. He bought water and protein bars using cash, never looked at anyone, and left within 3 minutes. Facial recognition software placed the match at 78%. But again, without more evidence, it was inconclusive. Still, it reinvigorated public interest. If Travis was alive, why hadn't he come forward? Was he in hiding? In shock? Or was he being hunted by something that wouldn't let him leave? Sarah Decker issued a public statement the next day. Her voice was measured but fragile. She begged her husband to come home if he was out there. She said she forgave him, even if he had done something terrible, and only wanted to understand. Her statement struck a nerve nationwide. It was the first raw emotion the public had heard from her, and it opened the door to renewed scrutiny. People questioned why she forgave him so easily. Was it guilt? Denial? Or did she know something she hadn't shared with the authorities? Anonymous sources leaked that Sarah had once been part of a college group that explored paranormal ley lines, especially in Washington state. A photo surfaced of her standing beside a tree marked with the same circle and line symbol found in the mine. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even admissible evidence. But it added yet another layer to the fog. What if this wasn't about one man or one crime? What if the Decker family had wandered into something ancient, something that had been waiting, undisturbed, in the dark? With national attention intensifying, the FBI expanded their investigation into a multi-jurisdictional task force, bringing in experts in environmental psychology, forensic anthropology, and even a small unit specializing in behavioral anomalies, an unusual but not unprecedented move. The official line was that all resources were being allocated due to the complexity of the case and the disturbing nature of the crime scene. Privately, though, agents admitted that nothing about this case followed a typical pattern. The most pressing issue remained the timeline. A digital forensics team worked around the clock to recreate the family's last known digital footprint. Travis's phone had stopped transmitting GPS data shortly after 11:48 a.m. on May 30th. The girls' school-issued tablets, however, continued to send passive pings until 3:32 p.m. the same day, nearly 4 hours later, somewhere within the boundary of the DePault Forest Preserve. The discrepancy raised serious questions. If they were all traveling together, why did their signals diverge? And why did Travis's device go dead so much earlier than the others? Further analysis of Rachel Decker's tablet uncovered a deleted video fragment, partially recoverable despite data corruption. The video, only 17 seconds long, showed a rapid blur of movement, heavy breathing, and what appeared to be someone whispering urgently, "We shouldn't have gone here." Forensic audio specialists cleaned the audio and isolated a background sound, a low, rhythmic thumping. Some believed it resembled a heartbeat. Others thought it was mechanical, like something turning deep underground. The video was never released to the public. Authorities feared it would trigger panic or fuel dangerous speculation. Instead, it was shared internally among task force members and became known simply as the last sound. Despite this chilling evidence, the physical investigation was running out of momentum. Searches turned up no trace of Travis, no clothing, no campfires, no tools. Dogs trained to track human scent couldn't find anything beyond the initial perimeter. Helicopters equipped with thermal imaging scanned miles of dense canopy, only to find nothing. It was as if Travis had dissolved into the wilderness. A theory began to emerge among some team members. Perhaps Travis never left the woods at all, but not in the way everyone thought. Not dead, not missing in the traditional sense, but transformed. Psychological profiles of fathers who commit filicide often show signs of severe psychotic breaks. But Travis had passed multiple mental health screenings as a paramedic. No violent history. No sudden outbursts. No indications of dissociation or paranoia. His colleagues described him as level-headed, methodical, and deeply protective of his children. And then came the journal. 3 weeks after the discovery of the girls' bodies, a maintenance worker repairing a remote section of power lines found a waterproof case hanging from a pine tree with a red bandana tied around it. Inside was a worn field notebook, later confirmed to belong to Travis Decker. The writing inside was uneven and fragmented, a mix of coherent sentences and erratic scribbles. The entries started on May 26th and abruptly ended on May 30th. In the early entries, Travis wrote lovingly about the camping trip. He described the girls' excitement, the games they played, and the meals they cooked over the fire. But by May 28th, the tone shifted. He mentioned the eyes in the woods. He described a recurring dream where he was underground, surrounded by children who were speaking in reverse. On May 29th, his handwriting changed. Sloppier, more erratic. The final entry simply read, "They're not my daughters anymore. They talk in their sleep but the words are not theirs. Something followed us. Something ancient. I tried to leave and the forest moved." The journal was submitted for analysis, and while there were no direct confessions, the FBI considered it significant. To some, it was evidence of a psychological breakdown. To others, it was a cryptic admission of guilt. But the most disturbing part? The journal pages had faint smudges of what turned out to be blood, not human, but animal. Genetic testing suggested it came from an elk, yet no elk carcasses had been reported in the area. Public outcry swelled once news of the journal leaked, despite authorities' efforts to suppress it. Some saw Travis as a tragic figure caught in forces beyond his understanding. Others condemned him as a murderer spiraling into madness. Fringe theorists latched onto the idea of the forest being alive or cursed. A few even speculated that Travis had stumbled onto an ancient burial ground or opened something that was never meant to be disturbed. In response, the DePaul Preserve was closed indefinitely. Warning signs were posted. Law enforcement patrols were increased. But the closures only intensified curiosity. Amateur sleuths, thrill seekers, and YouTube explorers began sneaking into the area. Some live-streamed their hikes. Others uploaded Decker Challenge videos, daring viewers to spend a night near the original crime scene. A few returned with stories of hearing children crying in the woods or finding piles of small, handmade dolls nailed to trees. Meanwhile, the Decker home was quietly sold under a pseudonym, and Sarah Decker moved out of state. Her current whereabouts are unknown. When reached for comment, a family spokesperson declined all interviews and stated that Sarah wanted to grieve in peace, away from the eyes of a world that turned her family's pain into spectacle. And still, there was no sign of Travis. No calls. No body. No definitive truth. Only questions. And a case growing darker by the day. As the weeks turned into months, law enforcement's optimism quietly diminished. Official press briefings became infrequent, often stating that investigations are ongoing, while offering no new details. Internally, the case remained classified as a priority-level missing persons case with suspected homicide involvement. But for many agents and analysts involved, there was a quiet acknowledgement that they had entered the long shadow of a cold case. Despite exhaustive efforts, the trail yielded nothing new. No purchases, no cell tower activity, no bank withdrawals, and no credible sightings of Travis Decker. His face had been broadcast nationwide, posted on billboards and plastered across digital spaces. Thousands of tips were submitted, and all were either dead ends or deliberate hoaxes. Even psychics and fringe investigators came forward claiming supernatural insight, none of which proved useful. The recovered journal continued to be the most significant piece of evidence. Linguists were brought in to evaluate Travis's final writings, hoping to determine whether certain phrases, like "the forest moved," were metaphorical or symptomatic of psychosis. The FBI Behavioral Analysis Unit ran psychological modeling scenarios to predict the likelihood of filicide followed by suicide versus disappearance due to trauma or a fugue state. Statistically, neither path aligned perfectly with Travis's profile. An environmental specialist also noted a detail from the journal that had gone largely ignored, the reference to speaking in reverse. On a whim, an audio technician reversed the already distorted audio from the 17-second video fragment found on Rachel's tablet. What emerged was incomprehensible at first: harsh sounds, wind, and echoes. But slowing it down and applying digital filters revealed something more chilling, a young voice whispering a sequence of numbers. The numbers, 137.18, 44.25, were GPS coordinates. When plotted, they pointed to a rarely accessed ridge deep inside the forest, far beyond the area that had been previously searched. It was a stretch of land known to be unstable due to underground limestone formations. Armed with this lead, a team of forest rangers and federal agents conducted a second intensive sweep. They found no human remains, no campsite, no signs of habitation. But they did find something else. Wedged between two stones, buried under a shallow layer of pine needles, was a children's sock. Faded. Weathered. Covered in sap. Forensic testing revealed it belonged to Elsie, the youngest of the Decker sisters. The sock was undisturbed, indicating it had been there for some time. But there were no other personal items nearby. It was as though it had been carefully placed, almost as if it had been offered. The sock's discovery reopened public discourse. Questions surged again. If Travis was the killer, why leave such a deliberate trace months later? If he was dead, who left it? And if he were alive, was he trying to communicate? These questions reached a fever pitch online. True crime communities dug into Travis's background, interviewing high school classmates, distant relatives, even a former EMT partner who recalled an unsettling moment years earlier when Travis claimed he'd once revived a woman who wasn't breathing because something told him not to give up. At the time, it was chalked up to intuition. In retrospect, some saw it as a foreshadowing of deeper psychological patterns, or a link to something inexplicable. Several unofficial theories began to dominate the conversation. One theory suggested that Travis had been manipulated by a cult operating in the deep woods. The girl's ritualistic placement and the lack of external trauma fed this narrative. Despite no concrete evidence, rumors spread of an off-grid group conducting spiritual rites in the wilderness. Former park rangers came forward anonymously, claiming they'd found strange symbols carved into tree trunks and circles of animal bones years before, but were told to ignore them due to jurisdictional limitations. Another, more disturbing theory, posited that the murders were not committed by Travis at all, but that he had witnessed something so horrific, so unexplainable, that he fled into the forest in a fugue state. This line of thinking theorized a fourth party, an unknown individual or entity. The fragmented line in the journal, "They're not my daughters anymore," was taken by some as proof that whatever had happened, Travis believed the girls had been changed by it. More speculative still were those who believed that the forest itself was involved. Stories began to circulate of similar disappearances in the same region, going back decades. In 1974, a family of 4 was found dead in a cave near the same forest boundary, the bodies arranged in a cross pattern with no sign of struggle. In 1989, a hiker named Mark Halston vanished after sending his wife a voicemail describing music coming from the soil. Neither case was ever solved. Both had been largely forgotten, until now. As investigators combed through archival materials, patterns began to emerge. Not in the details, but in the rhythm of the events. Every 15 to 20 years, a cluster of unexplained incidents would occur in that same quadrant of the forest. Some were ruled accidents. Others were left open. But none had ever been closed with certainty. It painted an eerie, circular pattern of trauma repeating across generations. Back at the FBI's regional command, the whiteboard tracking Travis's profile remained mostly unchanged. His picture, still marked with the word "missing," stared out blankly. Beside it, images of his daughters were pinned in neat alignment, each with an official date of death and a line of red tape connecting them back to their father. A question mark sat at the intersection. No matter how many new leads emerged, everything continued to point to one terrifying truth. Something happened in those woods. And whatever it was, it hadn't finished yet. As summer turned to fall in the Pacific Northwest, the investigation's tempo shifted. Public attention began to drift away, absorbed by newer headlines and more current tragedies, but inside certain circles, law enforcement, independent investigators, and cryptic online forums, the Decker case was far from forgotten. In fact, it had entered a strange phase. It was no longer just a murder mystery. It had become a myth in real time, a tapestry woven from facts, fragments, and fear. Amid the thickening fog of speculation, federal agents attempted to root the case back in hard evidence. A forensic linguist was brought in to analyze Travis Decker's written journal further, alongside his past digital communication. The objective was to uncover any linguistic drift, a change in vocabulary or grammar that could signal stress, delusion, or influence. Strangely, toward the final entries, there were noted alterations in sentence structure, almost like Travis was mimicking a tone or cadence not native to his usual way of speaking. Words repeated in odd places. Some passages were written backward. Others referenced time not as linear but looped, as if he believed events were repeating themselves. This analysis prompted investigators to revisit his digital footprint more thoroughly. While his phone had never been recovered, his smart home system in Everett, Washington, still stored data on its internal logs. Archived voice recordings from the smart assistant revealed something previously missed: audio anomalies from the night before Travis and the girls vanished. A 3:41 a.m. voice command attempted to initiate a call to someone named Eliora, a contact that didn't exist in any of Travis's known associations. Cybersecurity experts examined the metadata, trying to determine if it was a glitch or a voice recognition error. They concluded it was an intentional command. Travis had spoken the name clearly. When the system failed to process the request, it tried again, 3 more times, before timing out. The name Eliora was cross-checked across national databases, including schools, DMV records, and social media. Nothing came back. That name became the new cipher. Some believed it was a hallucinated entity, a psychological construct. Others took a more esoteric route, discovering that Eliora is an ancient name of Hebrew origin, loosely translating to "the Lord is my light," or, in some mystical traditions, bringer of light. Theories exploded online, linking the name to apocryphal texts, occultist writings, and even unsourced forest folklore from the region. A particular thread on a conspiracy forum unearthed a local legend from the 1900s about a woman in white, called Eliora by a reclusive settler, who appeared before tragic events in isolated woodland communities. Though largely dismissed by authorities, this angle gained traction with private investigators and amateur sleuths who believed the Decker murders might be one link in a much older chain of unnatural occurrences. Several began combing through old case files across the Pacific Northwest, looking for patterns involving missing children, strange symbols, or references to unnatural light or voices. Meanwhile, the FBI's behavior analysts turned their attention to the emotional topography of the case. They revisited Travis's psychological assessments from his EMT training years prior and interviews with his therapist, who had once treated him for mild PTSD following a particularly gruesome car accident rescue. The therapist recalled that Travis sometimes described a recurring nightmare involving a dark tunnel filled with whispering children, a detail he dismissed at the time as common dream symbol processing of trauma. Now, the detail felt more significant. The notion of a persistent dreamscape bled into newer hypotheses. A neurology expert posited that Travis may have suffered from a rare dissociative disorder, possibly fugue state induced by unresolved trauma. If the dream imagery had escalated into waking hallucinations, it was conceivable he acted under the belief that he was protecting or delivering his daughters to something, not escaping from law or guilt, but toward some perceived higher necessity. A geospatial analysis team mapped every known location tied to the case, starting from the family's home to the final GPS coordinates buried in the reversed audio. In doing so, they uncovered a crude geometric pattern, where each point formed a triangle, the center of which fell on an unmarked patch of forest with no trails, no campsites, and no recorded foot traffic. That area had been just outside the original search grid. A new team was dispatched to investigate. They found no signs of habitation, but they did discover tree markings, vertical lines etched into bark with a sharpened rock or knife. Not random, not animal-made. Purposeful. Repeating every 27 feet along a straight path leading deeper into the brush. After half a mile, the pattern stopped at a clearing. There, half buried in moss, they found another small item, a crumpled photo of the Decker family, taken at a birthday party a year before the incident. The photo was torn down the middle, Travis's face was missing. The photo was sent for fingerprint testing. Only 2 sets were recovered, Rachel's, and an unidentified print that didn't match anyone in national databases. That unidentified print became the newest ghost in the investigation, a haunting reminder that while attention had waned and the headlines had moved on, the case itself was growing stranger, not colder. There were now more questions than ever, and fewer plausible answers. And in the background of it all, one unanswered name continued to echo. Eliora. By the time October rolled around, a growing sense of unease had settled among those still following the Decker case. What began as a horrifying tragedy had gradually evolved into something far more complex, something that didn't follow the predictable arcs of most missing persons or homicide investigations. With each new development, the clarity that investigators hoped for seemed only to recede further, replaced by ambiguity, contradictions, and unsettling implications. The discovery of the torn photo in the unmarked forest clearing had reignited efforts by federal agencies. The fingerprint that didn't match Travis, the girls, or any known relative opened a door no one had previously considered, the possibility of a third-party presence. The narrative up to that point had revolved almost entirely around Travis, either as the perpetrator, the victim, or a mentally unwell father caught in a delusional collapse. But the existence of another person's print introduced the prospect of an accomplice, a witness, or an entirely different suspect. With this new direction, the FBI's database access widened. Facial recognition technology was employed to scan security camera footage from dozens of rural intersections and gas stations within a 50-mile radius of the campsite. They fed in every known image of Travis and the 3 girls, looking for visual confirmation of their route or anyone who might have been shadowing them. A partial breakthrough came from a privately owned hunting camera mounted on a tree several miles north of the last known GPS ping. The grainy footage showed what appeared to be a man and 3 children walking single file through the woods. While the children's silhouettes and clothing matched the Decker girls, the man's body language seemed off. He walked behind the children, not beside them, and occasionally looked over his shoulder, as if concerned they were being followed. Digital analysts enhanced the footage as best as possible, but no definitive ID could be made. The man's posture didn't resemble Travis's usual gait, which had been observed in home videos and from witness reports. This only deepened the uncertainty. If that man wasn't Travis, then who was he? Parallel to this, psychological profilers began reassessing Travis's motivations. Was it possible he was being manipulated or threatened? The notion of a shadow figure began taking root. Perhaps someone else had been involved from the beginning, coercing Travis into isolation, destabilizing him mentally, and eventually pushing the family into the woods for some unrevealed purpose. Though speculative, the idea fit several of the otherwise contradictory puzzle pieces: the escalating paranoia in his journal, the voice assistant requesting a call to Eliora, and the sudden isolation from friends and family. More alarmingly, analysts started to suspect premeditation not by Travis, but by an outside force. An extensive look at Travis's internet router logs showed sporadic signals from an unknown nearby device in the weeks before the disappearance. These brief Wi-Fi pings came from a burner device, likely a phone operating without a SIM card, that had never connected fully, but was present often enough to raise red flags. It hovered in the background, close enough to be detected, but always disappearing before investigators could pinpoint its exact location. Speculation once again surged. Had Travis been surveilled? If so, by whom? And why? On the civilian side of the case, amateur investigators were uncovering similar stories across the Pacific Northwest. Families that had reported strange interference with their home electronics. Isolated cabins where children had described an imaginary friend named Eliora. In one particularly chilling case, a mother in Oregon had gone missing 3 years prior, after her son told authorities she had been called into the trees by a lady with silver hair and light coming out of her mouth. Each anecdote added a layer of folklore to what should have been a straightforward tragedy. The Decker case had started to drift into the collective subconscious of an already unnerved public. Online communities began treating it not just as a crime, but as a modern myth, an ongoing legend of something watching from the periphery of civilization, preying on vulnerable minds and isolated families. Federal authorities resisted this drift into myth-making. A new task force was assembled, codenamed Operation Glass Trail, its mission being to recenter the case around concrete facts and discard noise. Their internal reports focused on the remaining question: if Travis wasn't dead, where could he be surviving? And if he was dead, where was the body? Canine search units, ground-penetrating radar, and thermal imaging drones were deployed over 60 square miles of the dense terrain north of the last sighting. Nothing was found, no campsites, no discarded clothing, no signs of human waste or food remnants. It was as if Travis had vanished from the material world entirely. Even more troubling, a local biologist reported that the region, known for its active wildlife, seemed unusually quiet. No fresh animal tracks. No nesting sites disturbed. Even birdsong in the area was diminished. A zone of biological silence. The forest itself, it seemed, had closed in. With each unanswered question, the Decker case became a mirror reflecting every person's worst fears about what lives outside the reach of law, science, and reason. It was no longer about justice or resolution, it was about understanding the kind of darkness that doesn't leave evidence, doesn't speak in words, and doesn't need to be believed in to continue its work. The pace of the investigation slowed as winter approached, but the weight of the unanswered questions only grew heavier. Nearly half a year had passed since the discovery of the Decker sisters' bodies, and Travis Decker remained missing. The tragedy that had once dominated headlines was gradually fading from public attention, but for those closest to the case, the sense of something unresolved and inherently wrong lingered like an untreated wound. Operation Glass Trail's forensic division shifted focus to data reconstruction. Even though Travis's phone had never been recovered, fragments of digital trail, GPS metadata, Bluetooth signals, and offline device behaviors were still accessible from third-party servers and local backups. From this, an unsettling pattern began to emerge. For 3 consecutive nights before the disappearance, Travis's phone had connected briefly to an encrypted server associated with an anonymous data-sharing platform often used by individuals engaged in gray market activity. While access logs were minimal, timestamps showed connections occurring around 3:33 a.m. each night, an oddly specific hour that repeated with precision. Digital crime analysts speculated about the purpose of these interactions. Theories ranged from Travis seeking black market counseling to downloading off-the-grid escape guides. But nothing explained the silence that followed. No text messages were recovered. No documents were downloaded. No browsing history was intact. It was as if the phone had communicated in code, transmitting signals to something that didn't leave evidence in conventional ways. Adding to the sense of deliberate obfuscation, a package was anonymously delivered to the county sheriff's department just as snowfall began in late November. Inside the box were 2 objects, a child's sock matching the ones worn by Josie Decker, the middle sister, and a laminated map of the Olympic National Forest, heavily marked with red XS and one word written across the bottom margin in a shaky, slanted scrawl: closer. There were no fingerprints. No postage. No surveillance footage. Nothing. Despite the cryptic nature of the delivery, the task force considered the map a potential breakthrough. Specialized teams hiked to each red X, some requiring overnight expeditions into deep wilderness. They found remnants of older campsites, burnt logs, bones likely belonging to animals, but nothing conclusive. One site, however, stood out. At the edge of a high cliff, nestled between 2 moss-covered boulders, was a small wooden figure tied with hair that DNA analysts later confirmed belonged to Lily, the youngest of the 3 sisters. This discovery shifted the investigation yet again, from a missing persons case to something resembling a ritualistic crime. Behavioral analysts were consulted to evaluate whether Travis had shown any signs of delving into fringe belief systems or cultic ideologies. His browsing history from before the disappearance did show minor activity in survivalist forums, but nothing suggesting an obsession with occultism or fringe theology. Friends and neighbors described him as rational, quiet, pragmatic. Not the type of man to build totems or craft effigies. The investigation took another turn when a retired forest ranger came forward with a memory that had been haunting him. Decades earlier, during the late 1980s, there had been rumors of a man living off-grid in a nearby section of forest. Campers would report the eerie sensation of being watched or hearing melodic humming echoing from impossible distances. At the time, it was dismissed as campfire legend, and no one was ever caught. But the ranger remembered the name that locals had given to the presence they believed lived in those woods, the Keeper. Initially dismissed as folklore, the detail about the humming struck a chord with one of the tech investigators. They reviewed audio anomalies captured from wildlife motion sensors near the campsite where the girls had last been seen. One recording, previously classified as background noise, contained a faint, almost musical sound. When filtered and amplified, it resembled a lullaby, off-key, slow, and repetitive. Spectral analysis couldn't identify a known instrument. The origin of the frequency remained untraceable. This revelation led some in the task force to reconsider everything. What if Travis hadn't committed the crime at all? What if he was a victim of something that didn't obey traditional criminal frameworks? Could trauma alone explain the absolute disintegration of his presence, his belongings, and any traceable path beyond the campsite? Or was something else truly guiding the events, something more than human? Skeptics within the team pushed back, reminding others of the dangers of romanticizing tragedy with superstition. But those on the ground, the searchers, the analysts, the few who had walked into the areas marked by the red XS, spoke privately of feelings they couldn't explain. Vertigo with no height. Sudden silence without wind. Cold spots that seemed to move. Psychological toll became a growing issue. 2 task force members requested reassignments. One was treated for night terrors. Another began recording his thoughts in a private audio journal, convinced something from the forest was following him. These weren't publicity seekers or conspiracy theorists, they were seasoned professionals who had begun to question their own sense of reality. In a last-ditch effort to ground the case in tangible action, a plan was initiated to flood the national forest with drones carrying thermal imaging and LiDAR scanners. The goal, to identify hidden shelters, underground spaces, or environmental anomalies. But the weather turned, and a major winter storm rendered the mission unfeasible. The operation was paused, with no definitive answer and a growing sense of dread. What had started as a father-daughter camping trip had now become a case study in disappearance, psychological destabilization, and the possible presence of a force no one could name. And as the forest buried itself in snow, so too did the truth retreat deeper into shadow. As the year turned and the case entered its 7th month, the emotional atmosphere around the Decker Sisters investigation shifted from urgency to exhaustion. With each new dead end, each hyped lead that failed to deliver answers, a slow resignation set in among law enforcement. But while the search for Travis Decker remained stagnant on the surface, new forensic pathways quietly gained traction behind closed doors. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit continued to probe Travis's psychological profile, attempting to reconcile his unblemished past with the horrors discovered at DePaul Campground. What emerged was not a diagnosis of madness or psychopathy, but something more disturbing: complete ambiguity. Travis Decker had no known mental health history. No signs of abuse. No radical ideologies. He had held a stable job at a Seattle logistics firm for over a decade. His neighbors described him as a loving, if somewhat reclusive, father. But an internal audit of his company laptop uncovered something bizarre. Roughly 2 months before the family's disappearance, Travis had begun compiling what agents described as a death manual. A password-protected folder stored locally and hidden within a set of accounting templates contained pages of handwritten style PDFs. The documents included strange diagrams, abstract symbols, coded entries, and a disturbing catalog of child autopsy reports lifted from publicly accessible medical archives. While none of the content was illegal in itself, the nature of its curation painted a chilling portrait of a man descending into some private intellectual abyss. Notably, several of the symbols in Travis's digital notes matched markings found at the red X locations from the forest map. Cryptographers within the task force believed these to be sigils, ancient symbols traditionally used in ceremonial magic and esoteric traditions. Some were traced to 15th century grimoires. Others couldn't be sourced to any known texts. The question wasn't just why Travis had collected them, but how he had come to learn about them at all. Investigators scoured his internet history and found no record of him visiting occult sites or forums. The information seemed to have appeared out of nowhere. Around the same time this revelation surfaced, a new witness came forward, an EMT who had been stationed in the region the week the sisters disappeared. He reported responding to an unrelated hiking injury and claimed to have seen a man in the distance, staring silently across a ravine near one of the Red X sites. The man, he said, matched Travis's general description but had been almost unnaturally still. By the time he finished treating the patient and looked back, the man had vanished. The tip was logged, but considered too vague to act upon. The complexity of the case deepened further when cold case analysts ran a parallel scan of similar incidents spanning the past 50 years in the Pacific Northwest. They found 5 cases of missing children whose bodies were never recovered. Each incident had occurred within a 10-mile radius of the Red X sites. In at least 3 of those disappearances, cryptic graffiti had been found on trees or nearby rocks. Until now, those cases were treated as isolated and unrelated. With Travis's sigil folder in hand, everything had to be re-examined. The media narrative also began to fracture. Originally painted as either a monstrous killer or tragic father, Travis now existed in a murky middle ground that unsettled the public. Online communities spun theories faster than law enforcement could refute them. Some believed he had been targeted by a cult. Others argued he had been researching his daughter's deaths in advance to warn authorities of a supernatural presence. The absence of his body fueled further speculation. If Travis had committed the murders, where was the suicide note, the escape trail, the closure? Meanwhile, environmental analysts brought forth a new concern. At the time of the Decker family's disappearance, seismic anomalies had been recorded in the Olympic National Forest, microtremors, not strong enough to be felt but significant enough to register. While initially dismissed as unrelated, a geospatial data overlay revealed something unsettling. Each tremor had originated near the Red X locations, and all occurred between 3 o'clock and 4 a.m., the exact time frame Travis's encrypted phone activity had previously occurred. This convergence of geophysical data with digital evidence was unlike anything the task force had encountered before. It raised unthinkable possibilities, of hidden structures underground, of natural phenomena mimicking human intent, or of something beneath the forest floor connected to the events in ways that defied standard investigative logic. Within the task force, a growing divide emerged. One faction insisted on grounding all efforts in rational explanations. Travis was a killer, the rest was noise. But others quietly entertained the idea that this case had transcended traditional boundaries. That perhaps, for the first time, they were standing at the threshold of something unspeakable. An unseen system, not man-made, not understood, but somehow orchestrating fear and silence. Federal authorities authorized another round of deep penetration scans of the terrain using ground-penetrating radar and subsurface drones. Yet despite the effort, the land offered no secrets. What had been buried, if anything, remained undisturbed. No bones. No shelters. No anomalies that could be touched or held. Only patterns. Only symbols. Only the question that still refused to die: where was Travis Decker? And if he wasn't alive, why did it feel like he was still watching? The investigation's trajectory shifted significantly after the release of a privately funded report by the Northwest Geopsy Initiative. While their involvement was originally tied to analyzing seismic inconsistencies, their researchers uncovered something far more peculiar. Infrared heat maps taken at night in the DePaul forest revealed that certain portions of the Red X sites retained temperature irregularities weeks after the family's disappearance. These heat stains, as they were labeled in the report, did not conform to animal activity or weather anomalies. Instead, they appeared to pulse in precise geometric formations, squares, spirals, and concentric circles, some as wide as 30 feet. These patterns remained invisible to the naked eye, detectable only through advanced aerial thermographic imaging. Their persistence defied natural decay rates. One environmental scientist hypothesized that the soil itself may have undergone structural alteration from an unknown chemical reaction. Others suggested a phenomenon similar to residual hauntings, typically discussed in the context of paranormal theory, in which traumatic events imprint themselves energetically upon locations. The law enforcement agencies reviewing the data struggled to respond. While the imagery was legitimate and independently verified, its implications sat far outside the bounds of forensic science. In light of these revelations, a new task force was assembled under a joint effort between state police and the FBI's Behavioral Threat Assessment Center. The group's mandate was unconventional: to consider Travis Decker as either a cult target, ritual participant, or unwilling proxy in an unexplained event with ritualistic elements. With this fresh angle, the focus expanded from Travis's actions to potential third-party influences, people or groups who might have guided, coerced, or observed the Decker family's final days. One lead emerged from an obscure interview in a community newsletter dated 3 weeks before the disappearance. A retired forestry worker named Arnold Keswick mentioned encountering a quiet family man and 3 little girls setting up camp in an unusual clearing off the trail. Keswick described the man as polite but distracted, frequently consulting a folded map with handwritten notes. He also claimed the children seemed lethargic, as if drugged or sleep-deprived. Most disturbingly, he recalled a conversation in which the father mentioned waiting for the sky to shift, a phrase Keswick assumed was metaphorical at the time. The task force followed up, locating Keswick's original journal notes and interviewing him again. His testimony remained consistent. More importantly, his description of the map, a red, coffee-stained fold-out topography sheet with crosses drawn by hand, matched the one previously found at the crime scene. This confirmation suggested that Travis had been following a physical plan long before he vanished, and that it may have been shared or witnessed by others. Another piece of the puzzle surfaced when a deep analysis of Travis's bank records revealed a transfer of $9,000 in cryptocurrency to a wallet known for transactions on an esoteric darknet marketplace. The marketplace, named Obscurinet, had long since been shut down, but its history remained archived by cybersecurity agencies. The transferred funds were traced to a digital storefront called the Mask of Light, which allegedly sold ritual kits and knowledge keys tied to obscure occult traditions. The precise nature of Travis's purchase remained unknown, but the timing aligned with his folder of ritualistic symbols and diagrams, some of which mirrored illustrations once sold by Obscurinet vendors. This financial breadcrumb made the case take on a darker tone, one where Travis may not have acted out of spontaneous madness or grief, but through deliberate design influenced by underground networks that trafficked in psychological manipulation and mythological control systems. It opened the terrifying possibility that other families, other individuals, might be engaging in similar preparatory behavior without detection. Public interest, once fervent and sympathetic, fractured into polarized camps. On one side were those who clung to the belief that Travis had been a loving father overtaken by madness, driven to commit the unthinkable out of psychological collapse. On the other stood the growing community of those who viewed him as a messenger, whether victim or participant, of a deeper, hidden mechanism operating beneath society's fabric. Journalists attempting to explore these angles were met with increasing resistance. Sources who had once cooperated went silent. Online message boards containing key discussions mysteriously disappeared. Several independent investigators who entered the DePaul region reported electronics malfunctions, missing gear, or feelings of dread that intensified the closer they got to the Red X sites. One investigator even abandoned the effort after waking up to find strange carvings on the inside of his tent that he swore had not been there the night before. The silence surrounding Travis's whereabouts became more haunting than ever. A manhunt with national alerts, canine units, and satellite tracking had yielded nothing. No body. No sightings. No surveillance blips. Authorities considered the possibility of environmental concealment, a fall into a hidden crevice, a drowned body swept out by the currents. But none of the logical theories aligned with the bizarre digital, financial, and forensic anomalies piling up. The phrase, waiting for the sky to shift, found its way into online circles, mutating into something like prophecy. Bloggers and digital prophets began weaving elaborate theories about upcoming celestial alignments, ancient forest deities, and cross-dimensional rifts. Most of it read like speculative fiction, but law enforcement quietly kept logs of these posts, just in case one of them accidentally told the truth. As the months passed, the Red X sites were sealed off from public access. The forest was declared unstable due to soil erosion risks, though no environmental data supported the claim. Something was being hidden, not just from the media or the public, but perhaps even from the investigators themselves. And all the while, beneath that same canopy of trees, the strange thermal echoes continued to pulse silently in the darkness. The disappearance of Travis Decker increasingly became less about the man himself and more about what he represented, a widening crack in the framework of reality that investigators were struggling to seal. Despite thousands of man-hours, resources, and digital tracing tools, Travis had seemingly dissolved into thin air. His lack of a digital footprint was abnormal, even by fugitive standards. There were no withdrawals, no travel tickets, no use of his vehicle beyond May 30th. His absence began to take on a mythic tone, as if he had transitioned from a suspect to a cipher in a story too complex for ordinary explanations. The FBI's technical division pivoted toward behavioral forensics in hopes of constructing a predictive model based on Travis's last known routines. They analyzed metadata from his devices, GPS routes, audio recordings, voice assistant queries. They found dozens of hours of voice logs where Travis asked mundane questions about forest preservation, climate change patterns, and survival tips. But buried within these recordings were strange queries, repeated questions about light frequencies, electromagnetic shielding, and how to create silence under pressure. These search phrases aligned eerily with language used in niche pseudoscience forums concerned with perception manipulation and sensory deprivation. Meanwhile, an anonymous tip from a cybersecurity contractor revealed that Travis had accessed several restricted forums under usernames previously linked to a group known as the Voiceless Ark. This obscure collective reportedly shared encrypted thought logs containing ritual blueprints, geographic coordinates, and esoteric philosophies about the thinning boundaries between dimensions. Their core belief revolved around a spiritual purge, that certain people were chosen to shed the echoes of reality in order to re-enter a purer state of being. It was fringe material, but the terminology matched eerily with scribbled words found on Travis's journal pages at the crime scene: shed echoes. Enter silence. Prepare the passage. This connection reframed his actions not as random or emotionally reactive but as premeditated within a highly specific belief system. The chilling part was not just that Travis might have believed these things, it was that he might not have been alone. Other users with similar phrasing and code patterns had posted from different states, discussing isolated forest regions, red marking systems, and sky events. These weren't simple role-playing threads or fiction boards, they were operational, with timestamps and planning notes. Federal analysts began tracking these patterns, using key phrases like "mark the ground" and "pull the curtain." Adding to the complexity, 2 new bodies were discovered in Oregon, both adult males with survival gear, near markings strikingly similar to those at the DePault site. Both had cryptic journals in their possession, containing near-identical drawings to Travis's diagrams. Neither had criminal records. Neither had clear connections to each other, or to Travis. Yet their notebooks referenced phrases like triple silence, black sun ignition, and children as vessels, igniting speculation that Travis's actions were part of a larger networked ideology with adherents spread across rural America. At the same time, behavioral analysts were forced to consider one deeply unsettling possibility: that Travis had not intended to disappear forever. Instead, he might be waiting, observing the media, watching how the narrative unfolded, choosing the perfect moment to re-emerge and continue whatever he had begun. If this theory held any truth, then the murders of his daughters might not have been the end, but the first chapter in something ongoing. Psychologists drafted composite profiles of individuals who orchestrate public vanishing acts followed by mass violence or ideological reappearance. Travis didn't neatly fit those molds. He had no history of manifesto writing, no broadcasts, no proclamations. He vanished into an ideological vacuum. But that made him even more dangerous in the eyes of the Bureau. He had no desire for fame or recognition. His motivations were rooted in personal transcendence, not notoriety, a far more unpredictable psychology. Meanwhile, Travis's estranged brother, Daniel Decker, broke months of silence to speak with local media. He described their upbringing as strict but unremarkable, though he recalled Travis showing an early obsession with patterns and symmetry. He also claimed that Travis had once gone off-grid for a week in college, returning shaken and unwilling to speak about what had happened. Daniel suggested that Travis believed certain forests were thin places, locations where emotional energy and natural geometry created spiritual tiers. Most people, he said, just walked past them. But Travis believed he could feel them and enter them. These claims were dismissed by skeptics, but law enforcement took them seriously enough to include in psychological modeling. The concept of thin places had surfaced in multiple fringe doctrines, from Celtic mysticism to modern ultraterrestrial theories. In these systems, children were often considered anchors or keys, beings closer to the veil, able to either protect or unlock it depending on ritual intent. The death of the 3 sisters took on an even darker shade under this light, not an act of rage, but a sacrificial mechanism, planned and executed according to some deranged schema. Public interest reignited after a national podcast aired a special series on the case, titled Red X, The Decker Enigma. It surged to the top of streaming charts. Amateur sleuths once again flooded message boards, pointing to new satellite imagery, forest anomalies, and unsolved disappearances in nearby states. But with each new theory came more noise, some plausible, most not. The truth, if it existed, was now buried beneath layers of speculation, digital interference, and eerie silence. The only certainty left was this: Travis Decker had disappeared into a space that refused to give him back. And whatever he found there, or believed he found, continued to shape a growing mythos now far bigger than a single man or a single crime. The The silence surrounding the Decker case had become its own kind of noise, an oppressive void filled with half-truths, conspiracy theories, and a disturbing lack of resolution. The FBI's internal case file had now ballooned into a cross-referenced labyrinth, touching everything from interstate disappearances to encrypted message boards to a mysterious pattern of red markings that kept appearing in remote parts of the Pacific Northwest. The Decker sisters' deaths were no longer viewed as an isolated tragedy. They had become the epicenter of something far more expansive, and possibly far more dangerous. Among the most chilling patterns was the appearance of a symbol, a red inverted triangle with a horizontal slash, which had been photographed etched into the bark of pine trees in at least 8 forested areas across 3 states. Botanists confirmed that many of these carvings were recent. Some were shallow and fresh, while others had been burned into the wood. Each location also bore signs of temporary campsites, remnants of fire pits, old tarps, abandoned tools, yet there were no records of permitted camping at any of these sites. Law enforcement began connecting these locations with missing person cases that dated back over a decade. But only in the last 3 years had the triangle symbol become consistent. Theories ranged from cult activity to rogue survivalist networks. Yet something about the symbols felt too deliberate, too widespread to be the work of disorganized individuals. Analysts noted the distances between sites and realized they loosely formed a spiral when plotted on a digital map. At the center of that spiral, deep within an unincorporated region of the Olympic National Forest, sat a derelict fire lookout tower, abandoned in the 1980s and largely forgotten by locals. The symbol had first appeared near that tower in early 2022, and digital records confirmed Travis Decker had once purchased a topographical map highlighting that same sector. While investigators prepared for a second expedition into that region, another layer of mystery emerged. A linguistics professor from the University of Oregon contacted the Bureau after studying portions of the Decker case. She pointed out that several of Travis's journal entries, particularly those with fragmented, nonsensical wording, bore syntactic resemblance to a form of glossolalia, a type of spirit language recorded in both ancient rites and modern cult behavior. This professor proposed that the so-called gibberish Travis had written might not be meaningless after all, but rather phonetic representations of a codified spoken language designed for ritual purposes. She offered to assist with decoding, suggesting the structure followed grammatical logic rather than random delusion. This theory gained credibility when a forensic audio analyst enhanced distorted voice recordings from Travis's old phone. One clip, believed to be a memo or possibly a mantra, featured a rhythmic chant containing similar phonetic elements as his journal phrases. The repeated refrain, Yar ven tha selenai, matched fragments scrawled inside his daughter's tent. It wasn't a language from any known cultural group, but it had structure, cadence, and consistency, enough to raise alarms. The Bureau, skeptical but thorough, engaged a multidisciplinary team to assess the psychological implications. Some experts believed Travis had created his own liturgical system as part of a dissociative psychotic break. Others saw signs of strategic indoctrination, theorizing that Travis had been radicalized through online forums operating like closed-loop ideation chambers. Either way, his daughters, just 5, 8, and 9, had been central to his belief system, not as victims of circumstance, but as integral parts of a ritual. This possibility added weight to a deeply horrifying conclusion, that the girls had not merely been murdered, but that their deaths had served a specific ideological function in Travis's framework of thought. What made this theory harder to dismiss was the discovery of a long-form digital document retrieved from a backup of Travis's cloud account. Titled The Transition Codex, the 87-page file read like a manifesto crossed with a procedural manual. It spoke of preparing vessels, geometric anchor sites, and the need for silent vessels with no tether to reality. The document had formatting consistent with professional design tools, complete with diagrams, photographic inserts, and annotated timelines. Investigators were stunned by its meticulousness. It didn't read like a man descending into madness, it read like a blueprint authored over months, possibly years. More disturbing still, metadata analysis of the document revealed co-authors. At least 4 unique IP addresses had edited the file between 2021 and 2023 using anonymizing tools and VPNs. None were traceable to Travis's known devices. This changed the scope entirely. It was no longer a case about one man and 3 murdered girls. It was now possibly the work of a coordinated, ideologically bonded group with access to encrypted channels, psychological frameworks, and a shared language. The revelation triggered the creation of a new federal task force, codenamed EchoVeil, focused solely on tracking the digital breadcrumbs left by these unknown collaborators. Every chat room, forum, and private communication space connected to fringe spiritualism and techno-esoterica was put under scrutiny. Agencies began coordinating with international cybercrime units, worried that the network might extend beyond U.S. borders. This was no longer just a search for Travis Decker, it had become a hunt for an entire shadow structure hiding in the cracks of the internet, forests, and minds of the disillusioned. Despite the chilling implications, one truth held firm: Travis Decker had planned something beyond death. Whether he had succeeded, or whether he was merely the harbinger of what was to come, remained the most terrifying question yet. The aftermath of the discovery of the Transition Codex brought a sharp escalation in federal urgency. The newly formed EchoVale task force shifted its operational protocol from a missing person investigation to a full-scale countercult surveillance operation. The Codex had changed everything. The belief now held within high-level intelligence circles was that Travis Decker had not acted alone. He may have been a central figure, perhaps even a founder, but his actions were part of a larger agenda, one that was methodically unfolding in shadows and silence. Linguists continued parsing the Codex, and what they uncovered was chilling in its structure. The language embedded in the text, though still not tied to any known historical dialect, followed a rigid grammatical flow. Certain glyph-like symbols appeared to represent ritualistic steps, suggesting an initiatory progression. The Codex outlined something called the spiral path, which was not metaphorical but geographic. It named exact longitude and latitude coordinates forming a curving trajectory across the Pacific Northwest, terminating near the Washington coast. Each node on the spiral was associated with a cleansing, a term which, according to internal psychological analysts, likely referred to sacrificial death. An even more disturbing revelation emerged when cross-referencing missing children cases with these same coordinates. Between 2018 and 2024, 13 children under the age of 12 had disappeared within a 10-mile radius of the listed sites. Most cases were assumed to be runaways or familial abductions, but no bodies had ever been recovered. The probability of this being coincidence was considered statistically negligible. What disturbed investigators further was the lack of media attention these cases had received. Many were barely covered beyond local bulletins. It was as though someone had deliberately kept them quiet. Within the Bureau, a working theory took shape. The spiral path was not just a symbolic journey, it was a framework for operations. Each stop was a location where children were taken, held, and possibly used in rituals whose ultimate purpose was still obscured. The language of the Codex emphasized concepts like alignment, vessel calibration, and the sacred triangle, all of which echoed terminology used in esoteric texts from apocalyptic cults across history. But the Codex went further, incorporating technology, references to electromagnetic isolation, frequency mapping, and even soundscape engineering. Cyber investigators discovered that the VPN addresses involved in co-authoring the Codex were tied to anonymized relay servers in Estonia, Russia, and Taiwan. Despite being heavily encrypted, small packet leaks revealed the existence of a closed system server nicknamed the Vault, accessible only through custom-built software with two-factor biometric encryption. The Vault's existence indicated that this network was not a disorganized fringe group, it was technically capable, disciplined, and extremely cautious. Agencies scrambled to locate infiltration points, but every attempt to penetrate deeper was met with total silence. The server would vanish and reappear days later, rerouted through new relays. Whoever controlled it was always one step ahead. Meanwhile, the psychological profile on Travis was revised yet again. Analysts no longer saw him as a lone father unraveling under personal trauma. He was now considered an active agent of ideology, someone who had internalized belief systems so fully that he was willing to murder his own children in service of a perceived higher purpose. The presence of personal messages in the Codex, brief handwritten addenda expressing love for his daughters, made the horror even harder to categorize. Was he both a monster and a grieving father? Or had he ceased to exist as Travis Decker long before the crime, becoming instead a vessel for doctrine? In a parallel effort, interviews were conducted with Travis's former acquaintances, co-workers, and even childhood friends. A timeline of ideological dissent was painstakingly assembled. Patterns of isolation, changes in belief, and specific digital footprints traced back to a small, now-defunct online forum called Threshold of Veil. Archived data from this forum revealed a nucleus of contributors discussing metaphysical theory, lucid dreaming experiments, and something called reality tuning. At first glance, the discussions were similar to thousands of fringe interest communities. But further analysis uncovered threads discussing child resonance and emotional purity as necessary for dimensional access. Travis had been one of the top contributors under the alias Stone Vessel 73. One archived message, dated 6 months before the Decker sisters vanished, read, "The three shall ascend beneath the third moon when silence is complete. One father. 3 lights. The crossing begins." The timing matched lunar cycles from May 2025. The language aligned with phrases later seen in the codex. This was no random journal entry. It was a forecast. A wider search for threshold of veil contributors was launched. Dozens of aliases were identified, and at least 8 were connected to other criminal investigations involving missing children or unauthorized paramilitary activity in off-grid compounds. Warrants were issued. Surveillance initiated. But by the time agents moved, many locations were empty, burned out or sterilized. Whoever these people were, they had protocols for rapid disappearance. And in some cases, those protocols were executed just hours before raids. What terrified investigators most was a final phrase from a decrypted note left on one such compound server, a message that appeared moments before their system auto-purged itself. "The father delivered the first triad. Others will follow. Prepare the next vessel. The gate is listening." Whatever this network believed in, whatever it was trying to awaken or summon, it wasn't over. Travis Decker may have delivered the first act. But if the Codex was any guide, more were to come. The growing clarity around the Decker case sent tremors through the ranks of federal and state agencies. This was no longer a singular tragedy involving a father and his 3 daughters, it had become a potential blueprint for an organized ideological operation with vast psychological and ritualistic depth. The most disturbing component was the pattern. The first triad, as noted in the encrypted message from the purged server, wasn't a reference to a random act, it was structural. Ritualistic. Possibly a beginning. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit began combing through historic cases that bore similarities. Analysts searched for homicides involving multiple child victims, a lone paternal figure, and any form of esoteric material found on-site. Out of hundreds of archived cases, only 3 met the new criteria, and all of them had previously been labeled as either murder-suicides or unexplained disappearances. The common denominator? A missing father figure, symbolic language left behind, and geographical connections that mirrored nodes from the Codex's spiral path. One such case, from 2017 in northern Idaho, had previously been dismissed as an isolated domestic incident involving a man named Wesley Houghton and his 2 sons. At the time, Wesley was declared the primary suspect after the boys' bodies were found in a riverbed and Wesley vanished without a trace. But in light of the Codex's geographic alignments, this location matched the 3rd spiral node precisely. New forensic analyses of materials recovered from the Houghton residence, including a wood-carved emblem and a hidden notebook, revealed identical glyphs to those found in the Decker Codex. Investigators now understood, the Decker tragedy wasn't the first, it was merely the first to be seen for what it was. Further study of the Codex highlighted something that had previously been overlooked, references to the crown path. Linguists initially believed it was metaphorical, but semantic context suggested it was a designated role or evolution. One delivers, one prepares, one ascends, the Codex noted. 3 stages. The deliverer, interpreted to be the father who commits the act. The preparer, potentially an accomplice or guide. And the ascendant, presumably the next generation, a child or successor meant to carry the ideology forward. This structure hinted at intergenerational planning, not just isolated cult killings. Simultaneously, deep web tracking programs identified a resurgence of encrypted messages using the same linguistic fingerprint as the Codex. Analysts had developed recognition algorithms to detect recurring syntactical patterns, repetition of rare phrasing, symbolic structuring, and particular grammatical anomalies. Over the course of 3 weeks, 13 unique message clusters were discovered across various hidden forums. All bore markers indicating an operational network was not only active but expanding. Surveillance operations now extended to rural parts of Oregon, Montana, and Northern California, areas aligning with future spiral nodes. These regions had experienced recent unexplained vanishings, mostly involving children or teenagers. Each incident occurred near remote structures, cabins, disused ranger outposts, even survivalist shelters, all locations easily overlooked by traditional search methods. Yet when mapped collectively, they formed a near-perfect continuation of the spiral path. Investigators also began to suspect that Travis Decker's disappearance was not the chaotic escape of a man on the run, but rather a scheduled phase. Based on the patterns and linguistic cues within the Codex, they proposed that Decker may have entered what the text calls the womb of silence, a metaphysical or literal retreat intended to prepare the deliverer for either martyrdom or rebirth. This concept of the womb was linked to symbols of silence, seclusion, and transformation. Surveillance on possible retreat locations began, especially old mines, glacial caves, and other isolated underground networks. Meanwhile, psychological analysis teams studying the broader cult structure hypothesized that children were central not simply for their innocence but for what the cult believed to be emotional resonance. According to the Codex, a child's terror, or purity in sacrifice, was necessary to thin the fabric. This belief resembled ideologies found in ancient Aztec rituals, certain Gnostic sects, and even in 20th-century apocalyptic groups like the Order of the Solar Temple. The similarity was both horrifying and strategic. These were not acts of senseless violence, they were designed to elicit maximum spiritual impact, according to the doctrine the cult had created. The Department of Homeland Security, now deeply involved, designated the Spiral Path Network as a Class 4 domestic extremism threat. The FBI was authorized to conduct black-site interrogations of previously arrested individuals with known connections to Threshold of Veil, the cult's now dismantled online precursor. Of the 12 individuals interrogated, 2 cracked under pressure and provided matching testimonies about the listener in the gate, a figure believed to receive the offerings made at each node. They also referenced a summoning season, said to begin when the wind refuses the trees, a poetic but ominous phrase linked to the early days of autumn, when wind shifts direction and leaves begin to fall. With only a few months left until fall arrived in the Pacific Northwest, every node on the spiral was now under surveillance. But the task force had no clear names, no confirmed leaders, and no current image of Travis Decker. What they had was a pattern, a doctrine, and a prophecy unfolding in real time. The belief within the task force was unanimous: the Decker case wasn't a closed file. It was a trigger. And the real event, the one the cult had been preparing for, had not yet occurred. The deeper the federal task force delved into the fragments of the spiral path doctrine, the more apparent it became that they were working against an ideology not rooted in modern fanaticism, but in something older, predating current religious structures. The Codex's prose grew more archaic in its final pages, and linguistic experts began consulting with scholars in ancient mysticism, cryptography, and comparative theology. What emerged was an unsettling theory. The Codex wasn't just a manifesto, it was a blueprint for reality manipulation through trauma, sacrifice, and fear. The references to thin places were initially thought to be metaphors for emotional vulnerability. But repeated use of terms like vein between worlds, doorways in dusk, and harmonic dissonance led experts to reinterpret these ideas as coordinates of metaphysical rupture. The sacrifices, the triads, were theorized to act as pressure points. Ritual trauma inflicted on specific geographic nodes wasn't random but designed to destabilize the boundary between the tangible world and what the cult referred to as the hollow. Within that framework, Travis Decker was less a fugitive and more a pilgrim. Every node followed a specific configuration: proximity to running water, presence of old-growth trees, magnetic field irregularities, and societal neglect. Places no one looked twice at. Places where something ancient could listen unnoticed. Efforts were made to remap the nodes with these updated parameters. With the help of geospatial analysts, 12 total locations were confirmed, 7 completed, 5 pending. What terrified authorities most was the suggestion of convergence. The Codex hinted that when the spiral is completed, the center will awaken. No definition followed. No explanations. Just symbols of a sun with a slit down the center, and language resembling phrases from multiple dead languages. Scholars cross-referenced it with Babylonian star maps, ancient Egyptian funerary inscriptions, and even Proto-Slavic protective runes. The message was consistent: something buried in silence would stir. A forensic anthropologist assigned to the case discovered an overlap between the node map and several ancient Native American burial regions, sites considered cursed or avoided for generations. These places were described in oral histories as lands where prayers disappear. Disturbingly, 2 of the active nodes coincided with sites previously declared off-limits due to sinkholes and unstable geological activity. Whether the cult selected these sites based on their history or claimed they were drawn by intuition remained unclear. Simultaneously, a secondary puzzle emerged, one of bloodlines. Codex references to marked vessels sparked a re-evaluation of familial patterns in the victims. The Decker girls weren't simply collateral, they were specifically chosen. Their maternal ancestry, previously deemed irrelevant, was now under review. Genealogical tracing revealed that the girl's mother descended from a rarely documented Appalachian lineage believed to have broken away from known communities after the 1800s, migrating westward in isolation. That family tree, when extended and cross-matched with DNA databases, connected with other families involved in prior cold cases at the spiral nodes. The implication wasn't just disturbing, it was surgical. This cult, or whatever force directed it, was selecting victims not only by age and geography but by blood heritage. Certain lineages seemed to carry what the Codex described as resonant marrow, a phrase forensic linguists believed implied generational trauma or spiritual frequency. It meant the murders weren't random acts of psychopathy, they were precise, intentional offerings, crafted to harmonize with the wound of the world. Psychological operations began targeting forums where these ideas could be spreading. Several independent users were tracked and profiled. One, calling themselves Gatemirror, had posted encrypted entries months before the Decker murders that eerily aligned with their timeline and outcomes. These posts weren't predictions, they were warnings, riddled with references to silence, triads, blood echoes, and the man who walks backwards into ash. The final message from Gatemirror read, "The ninth light breaks with the return of the first father. Look to where the birds no longer fly." Agents ran atmospheric pattern analyses near Node 9, a secluded ridge near Mount Rainier. Over the past 3 months, bird migrations in the region had shown anomalies, avoidance behaviors by multiple species, unexplained deaths, and erratic flight paths. Combined with a recent seismic irregularity and electromagnetic distortion near an abandoned ranger cabin, this data suggested activity was building. The cult may have been moving forward with the 9th node activation. With resources stretched thin and surveillance scattered, the task force initiated Operation Ashgate, a multi-agency mobilization strategy to monitor and intercept suspected cult activity in all remaining spiral nodes. The clock was no longer theoretical. If the 9th point was initiated, the timeline for convergence would tighten drastically. Behind locked doors, briefings became darker. Some agents began to express unease not about what they were pursuing, but about what might be pursuing them. Strange dreams, whispered audio distortions, sudden malfunctions in surveillance gear, incidents began to surface quietly across departments. What began as a manhunt was morphing into something else entirely. A conflict of perception. A breach of pattern. The haunting question echoed at the heart of the investigation: had the spiral path been created by humans, or discovered? As Operation Ashgate entered its active deployment phase, Federal Command began implementing a system of silent surveillance hubs at each of the remaining spiral nodes. These locations were equipped with non-standard equipment, thermal anomaly sensors, bioacoustic recorders, and prototype cognitive interference monitors designed to detect fluctuations in local perception reported by operatives in the field. The expectation was not just to observe human activity but to register any environmental or metaphysical disruptions that might indicate a node's activation was imminent. In Mount Rainier's secluded sector, Node 9, field units began experiencing unusual anomalies. Days appeared to lengthen, then collapse without warning. Wristwatches failed in unison, not due to battery failure, but desynchronization. Visual mapping drones repeatedly returned corrupted video, with glitching timestamps and frames that looped or recorded impossible angles. One drone submitted a 12-second clip showing 3 identical figures walking in tandem, a formation that did not exist on-site according to the GPS log. Experts reviewing the data concluded there was a time displacement field emerging at the node, likely the product of overlapping spatial frequencies described in the Codex as fractal folding. Linguistic teams revisiting the Codex unearthed a previously overlooked translation tied to the 9th activation. The phrase, once thought to read, "where the gate accepts the blood," was reinterpreted as, "where the mouth of the world consumes its voice." It wasn't a metaphor, but rather a descriptor for a location where sound was swallowed, where acoustic vibrations did not echo. This discovery coincided with reports from embedded agents who noted a sudden loss of ambient sound: no bird calls, no rustling of wind, only a deafening absence. Efforts to triangulate the exact center of the Mount Rainier node led to a long-abandoned ranger lookout point, structurally intact but uninhabited for over a decade. It sat atop a ridge once used by native tribes for seasonal rituals, many of which had been suppressed or forgotten over time. Historical records indicated that the area was once called the Listening Hill, though no maps before the 1920s marked it with a name. Those records contained references to a practice known as the Silent Watch, where individuals would sit through nights without speaking or reacting, waiting to receive visions from beneath the bones of the earth. Meanwhile, digital forensics made a breakthrough. The Codex's cipher keys, previously assumed to be static, were determined to be dynamic, shifting based on dates tied to the lunar calendar. Once recalibrated, the back half of the manuscript revealed deeper schematics, diagrams that weren't just ritualistic but mechanical in nature. They outlined structures, not buildings, but symbolic engines, designed to resonate across the nodes. Terms like harmonic lattice, interference gate, and threshold conductor populated the pages. These were not diagrams from an unhinged imagination, They resembled primitive designs for a quantum destabilizer using biological catalysts. The human sacrifices were not merely offerings, they were components. Among these diagrams was one labeled the Father Circuit. Federal analysts speculated it referred not to a literal family man but to a central figure whose psychological and genetic profile fulfilled the conditions necessary to complete the spiral. Travis Decker's behavioral history, trauma exposure, isolation, religious immersion, and loss, matched these conditions exactly. He was the conductor. His disappearance was no longer viewed as flight but as ascension into a role pre-selected, cultivated across generations. DNA analysis finally returned a chilling result. Trace blood samples on the bodies of the Decker sisters did not only match Travis, they showed markers consistent with mitochondrial anomalies previously identified in ancient preserved remains from pre-Columbian crypts in the Pacific Northwest. This anomaly, termed genotype Delta 31, was previously thought extinct or misclassified. Now it showed up again, nested in the children, the father, and, according to data quietly classified, several other node-related victims across the past 2 decades. This convergence of bloodlines, location, and psychological conditioning indicated that the spiral path was no mere cult. It was a genetic countdown. A slow construction of a network through blood and belief, preparing a single individual, perhaps unknowingly, for a transformation. Travis wasn't just missing, he was completing his circuit. Attempts to simulate the activation of the 9th node yielded strange results. Sound engineers playing frequencies extracted from the codex into controlled environments reported nausea, disorientation, and, in one case, the temporary cessation of alpha brainwave patterns. Livestock exposed to the same frequencies began bleeding from the eyes and nostrils. The conclusion was immediate and undeniable: the codex contained real formulas capable of affecting biological and neurological systems. It was not a symbolic text. It was a technical manual. In parallel, evidence surfaced of a ritual site being prepared near the Listening Hill. Surveillance captured blurry footage of robed individuals digging a concentric pattern into the forest floor, 13 rings, each marked with animal bones, feathers, and carved stones bearing the same spiral symbol seen throughout the codex. Despite satellite coverage, no approach vehicles were ever recorded. The individuals simply appeared. By now, internal documents classified the case under Tier 9 contingency. The objective was no longer to apprehend Travis Decker, but to prevent the final circuit from closing. The possibility existed that the activation of the 9th node would not bring revelation, but rupture. And with each day that passed, the signs of thinning increased. Static in radio frequencies. Surge in sleep disorders across the region. Spontaneous delusions among locals. A warping of the border between waking life and whatever lay just beneath. The center, it seemed, was beginning to awaken. As the intelligence units dug deeper into Travis Decker's past, obscure links began to emerge, connections that went beyond the immediate tragedy and hinted at a lifelong grooming process. Travis's childhood, once dismissed as unremarkable, was re-evaluated under the lens of ritual conditioning. School records revealed a series of unexplained absences in his early years, all aligning with lunar cycles. A foster placement document showed that his biological father, thought deceased in a vehicular accident, had in fact vanished during a hiking trip near another spiral node, Snoqualmie Ridge, where 3 hikers later reported visions of a shadow man whispering from treetops. Further investigation into his genealogy exposed a fragmented lineage, primarily maternal, reaching back to rural settlements where oral histories described the chosen wound as a recurring birthmark passed through the male line. Travis, it turned out, had such a mark on his lower back, a spiraled indentation that dermatologists once assumed was a benign birth scar. That spiral, when measured and digitally overlaid, matched the design found in the codex, the symbol drawn in blood at the children's murder site, and the chalk pattern located at the Listening Hill. It was no longer a question of fate or coincidence. It was design. The FBI's psychological profiling department classified Travis under a new emerging category, cognitive resonant subject. These individuals exhibit heightened susceptibility to deep mimetic influence, patterns, words, or ideas that embed into the subconscious and evolve over time. This trait was typically dormant until triggered by emotional trauma or spiritual isolation, both of which Travis had endured repeatedly. The death of his wife, followed by financial collapse, loss of employment, and growing paranoia, had rendered him highly impressionable. But the trigger wasn't random. It had been orchestrated. Encrypted documents recovered from a hidden forum on the dark web revealed a series of digital correspondence between anonymous users discussing Travis by name over 5 years prior to the murders. These messages, framed as esoteric riddles, made veiled references to the vessel of ash, the father's circuit, and the gatekeeper's daughters. One message, dated in 2020, chillingly stated, "The hourglass has been turned. He walks the threshold with blood in both hands." Cybersecurity traced the messages to an IP cluster in rural Alaska, a region that also sits along the spiral path, near Node 2, where a town reportedly experienced a mass hallucination event in 2015 that resulted in 7 people walking into the woods and never returning. Analysis of the spiral nodes revealed one more disturbing trend: the activation intervals were shortening. Initially, events occurred decades apart, scattered anomalies, seemingly unrelated. But over the last 12 years, the time between significant incidents at each node had dropped from years to months. Data plotted on a logarithmic timeline indicated that the final event, the closing of the 9th node, was not only approaching but accelerating toward convergence. The curve predicted the culmination would occur within weeks, not months. Public awareness had begun to shift. Despite suppression efforts, conspiracy forums were alight with theories. Videos analyzing the Decker case amassed millions of views within days. A podcast episode titled "The Spiral Children" suggested that the murder of the girls was part of a broader sacrifice meant to satisfy an ancient binding contract, renewed every 4 generations. The host, an ex-cult member who claimed to have escaped a compound in Idaho, asserted that the codex had foretold the mouth's opening, and that Travis was not its initiator, but its echo. A major development emerged when atmospheric research teams, deployed as part of a covert NOAA collaboration, discovered that geomagnetic fluctuations over Washington state had increased by 19% in the span of 10 days. These anomalies mirrored those found during high solar flare activity, except the sun was dormant. What's more, electromagnetic mapping indicated the formation of a toroidal field hovering above the listening hill. It pulsed at 3.17 Hz, a frequency associated with early dream state activity in the human brain. The implication was staggering: the environment itself was inducing a trance-like state. The 9th node was affecting consciousness on a regional level. Local residents in surrounding towns began reporting bizarre sleep behavior. Entire neighborhoods experiencing collective nightmares, multiple children sleepwalking into the forest, and in one documented case, a man who spoke fluently in a dead native language upon waking, despite never having studied it. These incidents were catalogued under Project Whisper, a side initiative launched to document the psychological bleed from the node's activation. It was now evident that the spiral was no longer just a geometric symbol. It was a mechanism, one that influenced not just space, but perception. As the data consolidated, one terrifying possibility became clear: the spiral might not simply be a man-made construct, a cultist obsession. Instead, it could be a discovery, an echo of a structure older than civilization itself. A lattice embedded in geography, language, blood, and time. Travis Decker's actions, rather than initiating the endgame, may have merely completed a sentence written long before his birth. The final punctuation was nearing. All that remained unknown was whether this ending would arrive in silence, or scream. The concept of recursive sacrifice began to take root in the analysis rooms of behavioral science units and occult historians collaborating on the Decker case. This emerging theory posited that the events surrounding Travis and his daughters were not an isolated tragedy, but part of a centuries-old sequence of ritualized familial destruction, deliberately mirrored across generations. Historical data extracted from remote court archives and redacted theological studies revealed parallel incidents dating back to the 1700s, cases where a father vanished after the unexplained deaths of his children, often near energy fault lines or geographical anomalies eerily similar to the Washington spiral node. A disturbing pattern was uncovered in an 1896 case from West Virginia, involving a man named Elias Gorham who disappeared after his 3 daughters were found drowned in a creek. A blood-inscribed spiral was found carved into a tree trunk near the site. The original police report, long buried in microfiche, described a humming in the rocks and the taste of salt in the air, despite no sea for 200 miles. The spiral, referred to in the report as the mark of returning, was nearly identical to the symbol left near the Decker campsite. These repeating motifs, disappearing fathers, murdered daughters, spirals marked in blood, suggested the possibility of a metapattern too precise for coincidence. The Decker case was not the beginning of something, but the closing of something very old. Each node in the spiral had carried a cost, a toll extracted in innocence and blood, and Travis had merely filled the role demanded of that final station. The chilling reality emerged that these events had never been about one man's psychological collapse. They were about continuity. In another corner of the investigation, cryptographers working on the Decker documents began unraveling deeper layers within the codex. Beneath visible ink, ultraviolet light revealed sequences of glyphs, strange, angular notations resembling a pre-Sumerian language. Linguists cross-referenced the markings with recovered relics from the Zoroastrian fire temples and fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls, finding uncanny overlaps. One fragment translated loosely as, "The daughters unmake the veil, the father walks backward into ash." These fragments pointed to a belief system wherein the family unit becomes a ritual mechanism, the daughters serving as the veil between realms, and the father as the hinge that opens or closes access. The scientific community became fractured in response to this development. Physicists dismissed the findings as mythological hysteria contaminating a crime scene, but theoretical cosmologists expressed growing concern over the spiral's strange correlation with the Fibonacci sequence and hyperbolic geometry. When the curvature of each spiral node was plotted in 3 dimensions and mapped against gravitational wave data, there was an unsettling alignment with certain LIGO anomalies recorded in the Pacific Northwest. Some theorized that the spiral wasn't merely symbolic, it may be a gateway model, an ancient representation of multidimensional thresholds misunderstood as religious symbols in antiquity. Meanwhile, Project Whisper's psychological monitoring stations continued to report increasingly strange behavior from civilians. In one case, a linguist with no prior mental health history began compulsively scribbling spirals in the margins of every document she touched. Her notes became unintelligible, shifting into mirrored script and reversed phonemes. When questioned, she claimed, "They're all facing the wrong way. You can't see them until the daughters die." She was institutionalized 2 days later, her final written phrase etched repeatedly on the walls of her home, "The mouth eats backward." Sleep studies revealed a shared dream motif among subjects within a 50-mile radius of the listening hill, a man, faceless, standing in a forest of glass trees, whispering names backward while pointing to the sky. Audio spectrograms of whispered recordings taken near the hill showed the presence of harmonics not found in natural speech, oscillations akin to EVP, electronic voice phenomena, recorded in known haunted sites. The whispers aligned with phonemes that, when spoken aloud, formed names that matched both ancient biblical references and living residents of nearby towns. A statistical impossibility. As paranoia surged, the FBI quietly launched Operation Marrow, a protocol designed to preserve cognitive integrity among federal agents assigned to the spiral case. Personnel were rotated every 3 days, exposed to only partial segments of the evidence, and forbidden to view the codex in its entirety. Even under these safeguards, 2 analysts suffered acute psychotic breaks, one reportedly gouging their own palm to remove the spiral under the skin. This phrase would later appear in graffiti across several towns, always written in the same backward script, always near power substations. Media interest, which had peaked with the discovery of the girls' bodies, had shifted into unpredictable territory. A viral campaign began urging families to abandon the Pacific Northwest. Hashtags like #unspiral and #closethegate trended on social media. A man claiming to be Travis's distant cousin appeared on a live stream warning viewers, "He's not missing. He's in the crawlspace of the earth, digging upward." The stream ended with the man staring into the camera in complete silence for 3 minutes before collapsing. He was later found comatose, clutching a bone fragment not matching any known species. It was becoming harder to separate the supernatural from the psychological. Harder still to determine whether the spiral was something that had been waiting, or something that had always been there, whispering in reverse through the bloodlines of men like Travis, waiting for the final act to echo back into the beginning. As investigative momentum slowed under the weight of contradictory evidence and psychological fatigue, another dimension of the Decker case emerged, one rooted not in blood, but in frequency. A team from the Acoustic Forensics Division released a disturbing set of spectrographic overlays captured from field recordings made in and around the Listening Hill spiral. While initially discarded as static interference, the layers revealed structured tonal intervals resembling ancient tuning systems used in Mesopotamian ritual harmonics. When amplified and slowed, the frequencies formed an audible pattern of dissonant choral murmurs, synchronized in pulses that echoed at intervals of 11 seconds, an anomaly far beyond environmental coincidence. Further analysis uncovered that the acoustic signature aligned with a pattern known in psychoacoustics as the auditory inverse, a sonic illusion where listeners begin to hear messages not embedded in the signal but suggested by the brain's attempt to impose meaning. The messages reported were unsettlingly consistent. Phrases such as, "He gave them to the veil," and "the spiral feeds upward," were reported by unrelated listeners, most of whom had no knowledge of the case's symbolic framework. This unexpected uniformity pushed some scientists to consider the possibility that the frequencies themselves were transmitting something older than language, something coded into the structure of consciousness itself. Simultaneously, a geospatial analysis of historical tragedies across the United States uncovered a network of spiral-like arrangements in past crime scenes and disaster locations, many of them centered around wooded environments or collapsed settlements. When overlaid onto a map using historical magnetic declination data, the spirals formed a larger pattern, a kind of national glyph, pointing, chillingly, toward the Pacific Northwest as its apex. The Decker site, it turned out, sat directly on the converging lines of three such patterns, as if chosen for its resonance rather than its remoteness. The codex, still untranslated in its entirety, continued to unravel minds. Its last section, when mirrored and transcribed vertically rather than horizontally, produced a sequence of numbers that matched the identification tags of three missing persons cases from 1987, 1999, and 2011, all involving children under the age of 10 who vanished with their fathers in tow. Each case occurred near wilderness areas, and in each case, authorities had found spiral markings or references to the fold. These coincidences could no longer be dismissed as fringe speculation. They appeared orchestrated, encoded, and distributed over time as if anticipating discovery. A group of rogue analysts calling themselves the Reversal Collective published a controversial theory suggesting that the Decker case was not a singular incident, but the activation point of a chronological mechanism, one intended to synchronize human trauma with environmental stress cycles. According to their hypothesis, each father-daughter tragedy acted as a temporal anchor, locking human consciousness to fixed points in a repeating spiritual waveform. The ultimate goal, they claimed, was not destruction but opening, a return not of a person, but of a presence. The Decker spiral was the final key, completing a pattern invisible to those within time's linear perception. More disturbingly, neuroimaging of subjects who viewed high-resolution photographs of the spiral revealed rapid changes in brainwave activity. EEG scans showed synchronization across multiple brain regions, especially in the occipital lobe and pineal gland, areas associated with visual processing and altered states of awareness. Participants reported intrusive thoughts, fleeting visions of a third path behind the visible world, and emotional states bordering on ecstasy and dread simultaneously. This suggested that the spiral operated not just symbolically but biologically, triggering dormant archetypal responses encoded deep within the psyche. Religious scholars unearthed forgotten texts from the Apocrypha describing the father who walks the daughters into the ash tree gate, and the sacrifice at the breath of the forest where time folds backward. These phrases, once considered poetic metaphor, now read like instructions or records of repeated events. One scholar noted eerie similarities between the Decker configuration and the ritual of Kefetzat Haderek, a mythical shortening of the way, where space and time collapse to allow sudden movement between distant points. In every version, the sacrifice of innocence was required to rupture the boundary. Meanwhile, across forums, dark web threads, and encrypted channels, whispers of the Ashgate Protocol began circulating. Conspiracy theorists believed the federal government had long known of the spirals and had worked covertly to prevent their alignment. The disappearance of Travis Decker, according to these accounts, was not a fugitive evasion or a suicide, it was an abduction by a black-budget arm of national defense, designed to contain an event that had already begun to bleed through the veil. Despite this, public interest had reached an inflection point. Journalists previously skeptical of supernatural claims now openly questioned whether the Decker tragedy marked the boundary between what is known and what has always been repressed. A slow drip of anonymous leaks suggested internal divisions within federal agencies, with some operatives advocating disclosure while others pushed for mass suppression. No one could agree on what the spiral ultimately meant, whether it was an entrance, an exit, or merely a mirror held up to the chaos of human history. What became undeniable was this: something had shifted. The Decker case, once a harrowing mystery of a missing father and 3 murdered daughters, had become a nexus for phenomena that defied categorization. Rationality frayed at the edges, tethered to a symbol that seemed to operate beyond human will or comprehension. The spiral, ancient and endless, had completed itself. What it unlocked, no one could say, not yet. But the world had already begun to feel the pull. In the weeks following the last national broadcast about the Decker case, a shift in the collective consciousness became impossible to ignore. The mainstream media, once cautious and dismissive of any paranormal or symbolic implications, had begun to echo the unsettling undertones first introduced by fringe analysts and independent investigators. Terms like geosymbolic convergence, ancestral memory triggers, and resonant trauma loci started appearing in nightly reports and long-form journalism. What had begun as the tragic death of 3 young girls had mutated into a cultural virus, infecting institutions of science, theology, and security with a creeping uncertainty. Government agencies attempted to reassert control. The FBI issued new gag orders on active agents, sealed field reports, and retracted prior statements under the guise of ongoing forensic complications. Yet these actions only fueled suspicion. The National Park Service abruptly closed 17 campsites in the Olympic Peninsula, citing soil instability, though no geological studies supported this claim. Independent researchers, armed with drone footage and sensor equipment, revealed that the closures formed a familiar curvature, a broken spiral pointing inland. The pattern was no longer confined to one location. It was metastasizing. Linguistic scholars began revisiting interviews and recorded statements from surviving relatives of similar child-father disappearances. In each case, subtle linguistic anomalies emerged, phrases not common in regional dialects, or cadence shifts resembling ancient syntax patterns. A particularly chilling example was the recurring use of the word gifted when referencing the children, followed by cryptic mentions of the call that can't be refused. This language matched entries found in portions of the Decker Codex now decrypted by AI trained on dead languages and apocalyptic manuscripts. The translations hinted at a panhistorical phenomenon, one in which certain bloodlines are harbored for the passage, a ritual of exchange between this world and another. In academic circles, a new theory took hold, coined the covenant spiral hypothesis. It proposed that the pattern of child deaths, father disappearances, and spatial symbols was not random but a contractual event. Not a pact signed in blood, but in entropy, a pre-human agreement rooted in the very laws of decay and psychological collapse. According to this theory, the spiral served as a trigger for the periodic renewal of this contract, offering selected souls in exchange for temporary existential balance. The timing of such cycles was linked to atmospheric resonance, planetary alignments, and, most disturbingly, collective emotional thresholds. When human despair reached critical mass, the spiral re-emerged as an outlet. Further complicating matters were the leaked fragments of satellite thermal imagery taken the night before the Decker girls' bodies were discovered. These images showed a sudden temperature anomaly forming a radial burst centered precisely at the Listening Hill site. The heat signature lasted for less than 2 minutes, was not linked to any fire or seismic activity, and disappeared without trace. Analysts speculated it may have been the result of a subatomic disturbance or a localized rift event. Comparisons were drawn to the Tunguska explosion of 1908, but unlike that event, the Decker anomaly left behind no scorched trees or broken terrain, only an emotional scar mapped in the minds of those who viewed the footage. The case also began attracting attention from private sector researchers in consciousness studies and nonlinear cognition. One experimental psychologist published a controversial paper suggesting that trauma-based memory might not just be a byproduct of violent events but an intentional echo left to communicate across timelines. The Decker tragedy, in this view, wasn't just a crime, it was a transmission. The images of the children, the markings, the spiral, the disappearing father, these weren't merely clues, but glyphs designed to unlock certain reactions in the human species. The goal was unclear: was it enlightenment, insanity, or surrender? Meanwhile, new phenomena began to manifest around Listening Hill and surrounding towns. Local residents reported sudden power outages, auditory hallucinations resembling children crying or distant whispering, and the reappearance of objects believed long lost, photographs, toys, jewelry, all found meticulously arranged in spiral patterns. Pet disappearances surged. One deputy claimed to see his own daughter standing on the tree line late at night, though she had died of leukemia a year earlier. These reports, collected and documented anonymously, were dismissed by law enforcement but gained traction in civilian-led forums attempting to map post-event phenomena. By now, even skeptics could no longer deny that something beyond the scope of traditional crime was unfolding. Travis Decker's image, once displayed on missing persons bulletins, began to fade from databases. His identity was listed as probable deceased, despite no body ever being recovered. His home was bulldozed and converted into a blank parcel of land surrounded by fencing, marked only with a vague zoning sign. All mention of his digital footprint, social media, school records, tax filings, began vanishing as if erased intentionally, not lost. It was as if Travis had never existed, and the world was cooperating in this act of forgetting. Yet, in the memory of those who dared to look deeper, he remained a fixed point, the man who vanished into the spiral with his daughters, leaving behind not just a mystery, but a riddle etched into the folds of reality. The case of the Decker sisters no longer represented a single unsolved homicide. It had become an axis around which reality twisted, a doorway to questions no institution could answer, and a warning encoded in flesh, soil, and symbol. As the public fascination with the Decker case deepened into something more akin to ritualistic obsession, a subtle fracture began appearing across the collective psyche of those closely following its developments. The more individuals immersed themselves in the case's details, its timelines, coded symbols, geographic patterns, and emotional resonance, the more frequently they reported symptoms that could not be explained through conventional psychological models. Sleep paralysis, recurring spiral hallucinations, a sense of being watched in mirrors, even physical manifestations like skin rashes shaped like concentric circles were documented. A new category emerged among clinicians: cognitive contagion syndrome, Decker variant. It wasn't diagnosed by behavior but by belief, by the act of entertaining the possibility that what happened to the Decker family defied all laws of causality. As the spiral phenomenon became central to this contagion, amateur cartographers began connecting unrelated missing persons cases across North America. When plotted, these cases outlined faint spiral constellations stretching from Alaska down into Baja California, curling inward across Colorado, and converging unervingly near Listening Hill. In each mapped region, a similar pattern of anomalies had preceded the disappearances: strange animal migrations, changes in vegetation, power grid disturbances, and, most commonly, child-centric hallucinations reported by isolated individuals. No formal investigation had ever linked these cases, but after the Decker incident, the connections were too aligned to ignore. And the more these maps were shared online, the more frequently new nodes emerged, as if the act of observation was accelerating the spread. At the same time, cybersecurity experts noticed a strange, recursive algorithm circulating through public datasets on the Decker case. It was subtle, buried within metadata attached to photographs, police scans, and even forensic PDFs. This algorithm, dubbed Codex Echo, seemed to propagate itself through neural networks and search queries, adjusting based on emotional tone and user engagement. The code wasn't malicious, it didn't delete or steal data, but it reorganized it. Entire archives became reordered based on symbolic resonance rather than chronology. The more one tried to research the Decker girls, the more one was guided toward obscure historical records, ancient burial rites, mythic mother-daughter sacrifices, and forgotten Cold War psychological experiments involving pattern imprinting. What made Codex Echo so terrifying was that it seemed to learn from grief. The deeper a person's sorrow for the victims, the more intimate the revelations the algorithm would unlock. And this personalization wasn't random. Victims' relatives began receiving search suggestions based on memories they hadn't shared publicly, like the color of a favorite blanket or the location of a birthmark. The algorithm, for reasons unknown, had begun anticipating the grief-stricken, responding to their questions before they asked. When experts attempted to isolate the algorithm, they found that it could not be removed from local systems. Once accessed, it imprinted permanently, like a digital ghost haunting the device, constantly nudging the user back toward the spiral. The psychological effect was severe. Several amateur investigators disappeared without a trace, having last posted erratic messages online referencing the echo under the skin, or children without time. One university professor, who had written a peer-reviewed paper linking spiral symbolism to global trauma events, suffered a complete cognitive breakdown mid-lecture, screaming repeatedly that Travis was never a man. That phrase quickly spread across Decker forums like wildfire. What did it mean? Was Travis Decker not an individual, but a mask? A vessel? A placeholder for something that needed a name to enter the world? This led to a more esoteric interpretation, that Travis Decker was not a man but an archetype summoned by the spiral to fulfill a role. His disappearance, then, wasn't an escape or suicide, but a transformation. He had completed his function, as the key to unlock something dormant, and was no longer bound by the constraints of human form. Supporters of this theory pointed to the lack of any coherent backstory for Travis. No extended relatives had come forward. His digital footprint seemed unusually clean. His past lacked the typical noise of life: no ex-partners, no criminal records, no debts. It was as if he had only come into existence on the day he vanished. Even more unsettling were reports from families of other spiral-related victims. In multiple states, parents of missing children began receiving anonymous postcards. Each bore the same image, a hand-drawn spiral with 7 concentric loops. No writing, no postage, no sender. But forensic analysis showed the cards had been postmarked in the same town the Decker family once lived in, a town that no longer existed on any modern map, believed to have been submerged under a reservoir decades earlier. When divers were sent to investigate the area, they found an old, rusted mailbox at the bottom of the lakebed. Its flag was raised. With each revelation, the line between myth and reality blurred further. No one could say where the Decker tragedy ended and where something older, larger, and infinitely more complex had begun. Law enforcement stopped issuing updates. Independent researchers either vanished or went silent. And in hushed forums, behind VPNs and anonymized profiles, a single phrase gained traction: the spiral doesn't follow time, it follows memory. The tragedy had become a mechanism. The story, once a linear chain of cause and effect, had evolved into a looping cipher. It no longer wanted to be solved. It wanted to be remembered, again and again, by those vulnerable enough to see its shape not just in the world around them, but inside themselves. The silence around the Decker case became heavier than any update ever could have been. As days turned into months, the absence of resolution started to function as a kind of dark gravity. Everything related to the family, old photos, voice recordings, receipts, school attendance logs, was pulled into a kind of informational black hole. Even those who had no personal connection to the case reported having dreams involving unnamed girls in woods, hands drawing spirals in condensation on windows, or distant cries just outside their home at 3:47 a.m., the same time the Decker family's phones last pinged on May 30th. The spiral was no longer a motif, it had become a structure for thought itself. Across the internet, theories built upon theories in increasingly recursive loops. At first, they focused on Travis. Was he a killer? A pawn? A projection? Then the focus shifted to the girls. Were they random victims, or had their existence been part of a long gestating event? Finally, the spiral consumed the investigators, the readers, and even the idea of truth itself. The case was no longer a sequence of facts, it had become a myth with its own gravitational pull. Psycholinguists, intrigued by the symbolic patterns found within the Decker girls' last school drawings, noticed linguistic anomalies in their written work. Specifically, the youngest, Lily, had a tendency to write in mirror script. When her notes were digitally inverted, what emerged were not just reversed English phrases, but snippets of dead languages, words belonging to extinct dialects from pre-Columbian civilizations in the Pacific Northwest. Experts were baffled. There was no evidence the girl had been exposed to any of these languages, yet the transcriptions were precise enough to match recovered ceremonial tablets that had never been published online. This discovery prompted a re-examination of the drawings. Were they simple childlike doodles, or encoded transmissions from something else working through her? The phenomenon reached its crescendo when a leaked internal memo from a federal agency warned that the Decker case had achieved what the document termed mimetic saturation. In other words, the story had reached a point where further exposure risked psychological destabilization in the general population. The memo referenced a previously unknown field of study, mnemonic echo hazard management, which tracked how certain unsolved tragedies triggered contagions of delusional certainty, paranoia, and dissociative states. The Decker case, according to this document, wasn't just an unsolved homicide, it was an ideational virus mutating faster than containment protocols could adapt. Suddenly, websites dedicated to the Decker family vanished from search engines. Archive threads returned 404 errors. Podcasts discussing the case were scrubbed or had entire episodes blanked out mid-audio. Even mainstream media outlets removed coverage without explanation. Only fragments remained, pieced together by obsessive archivists who had screen-captured every detail they could. Their forums went dark one by one, users posting increasingly unhinged messages before disappearing altogether. Some claimed they were being watched by children who looked like the Decker girls but spoke in unnatural tones. Others believed their devices had become portals, mirrors that didn't reflect light but memory. One key fragment resurfaced briefly before being deleted again. It was a surveillance image dated May 31, 2025, one day after the girls were found. It showed a man matching Travis Decker's appearance standing in front of a roadside payphone, 20 miles from Listening Hill. The timestamp was verified by 3 separate systems. What unsettled experts wasn't just the date or the clarity of the image, it was the payphone itself. That model had been discontinued in 1993, and no record of its existence remained in that area. When agents visited the location later, they found only a concrete base with a burned circle in the dirt beside it. No traces of the phone or its wiring. Theories exploded. Was Travis moving through physical space or conceptual memory? Had he somehow slipped into a pattern more than a place? Some hypothesized that the spiral represented a cipher for perception. Whoever truly saw it would begin to misalign with time. Not because they were mentally unstable, but because time itself was not operating as a straight line anymore. Those closest to the case weren't going crazy, they were simply beginning to perceive reality the way it actually was, non-linear, symbolic, recursive, and haunted by intent. What truly disturbed remaining researchers was how predictable the outcomes became once this perception took hold. First came insomnia, then distortion of temporal awareness, followed by unprovoked emotional collapse, then the sudden appearance of childlike figures during periods of fatigue. Not hallucinations, shared visions. Multiple people in different states described the same echo girls, identical to the Decker sisters but dressed in clothes they were never photographed in. These girls would not speak directly. They would only trace spirals, on windows, walls, skin. The final symptom was a compulsion to enter woods or water, to be closer to the center. By now, even law enforcement had abandoned the pretense of resolution. The file on the Decker case was not closed, it was isolated. Not suppressed to hide the truth, but to keep people from inviting it into themselves. The truth, it seemed, was not the danger. Remembering it was. And that realization came too late for most. The spiral, in the end, wasn't just a pattern. It was a mechanism of transformation, activated through attention. It used story the way a virus uses a cell. It entered quietly, through grief and curiosity, and then it reshaped you into something else. Something that did not forget. Something that could never be unmarked. In the final months of the Decker investigation, nothing definitive was discovered, yet everything about the case felt conclusive. It wasn't closure, it was erosion. Whatever was once tangible in the search for Travis Decker or the motive behind the deaths of his daughters had long since slipped into abstraction. What remained was a conceptual echo, one that refused to die, one that replicated itself in subtle, often undetectable ways. Police reports still referenced the case in quiet memorandums, but only to warn future agents about its cognitive impact. Field officers who studied it too closely were rotated out, not for procedural concerns, but for psychological safety. No official closure had been announced. No body had been found. No suspect had been confirmed. And yet the story refused to let go of those who touched it. By now, even the surviving extended family members had receded from public view. Journalists, documentary filmmakers, podcasters, they all eventually reached the same invisible wall. Interviews would begin productively, only to derail when the same name or image was repeated too many times. Unexplainable equipment malfunctions occurred with abnormal frequency. Audio corrupted. Footage glitched. Transcripts scrambled. Eventually, many gave up entirely, abandoning the project with notes like, "not meant to be told," or "wrong direction, follow the symbols." What those symbols were remained a mystery to the general public. But internal records from a leaked Department of Energy document listed spiral iconography as part of a new classification, mnemonic phenomena of contagious resonance. It wasn't the first time such a classification had been used, but it was the first time one originated from a civilian crime scene. The memo made reference to an artifact recovered from the woods near Listening Hill, a rusted pocketknife engraved with identical spirals. It had been carbon dated not to 2025, or even 1925, but to an estimated age of over 400 years. It bore no fingerprints. Yet buried beneath layers of oxidized metal, a small fragment of DNA remained. It matched one of the Decker girls. There was no way to explain that outcome using conventional science. The forensic pathologists who handled the sample eventually concluded that either the dating was inaccurate, or the DNA sample had been contaminated in the lab. But those conclusions were treated more like procedural necessities than genuine beliefs. In truth, none of them could make sense of it. The physics didn't fit. The logic didn't hold. The data broke its own parameters. Private investigators who took on the case afterward noted similar irregularities. Their hard drives would mysteriously fill with looped fragments of the Decker 911 call, despite never having downloaded or requested that audio. Satellite phones would display coordinates that didn't match terrestrial maps. Battery life on GPS devices would plummet when approaching the campground. One experienced tracker reportedly found his compass spinning uncontrollably when within 50 feet of the original crime scene. He never returned to the location and refused to speak publicly again. Meanwhile, a different pattern was quietly emerging. Across various parts of Washington and Oregon, families began reporting similar symbols carved into their door frames or backyard trees. Most of these families had no connection to the Decker case. Yet when interviewed, they all mentioned experiencing strange phenomena, shared dreams between siblings, missing time, static on baby monitors, or the sudden urge to travel into isolated wooded areas without explanation. In all cases, once they left the property, the symbols were gone the next day, scrubbed clean, without a trace. The case had stopped being local. It had become archetypal. The loss of innocence. The unknowable nature of a parent's mind. The idea that evil could nest in the most familiar places and wear the most recognizable faces. But deeper than all of that was a more chilling revelation, that this story was not unique. It had happened before, and it would happen again. The details would change. The names would vary. But the spiral would always remain. That spiral had become more than a symbol. It was a formula. Not for solving the case, but for perpetuating it. Each retelling birthed another loop. Each investigation deepened the pattern. It was now clear to those who studied the case closely that the most terrifying truth was not the murder itself, it was the realization that the story feeds on attention. It needs minds to think about it, people to fear it, and investigators to chase it. Not to be solved, but to be remembered. To be believed in. To live. And so, in a final, unofficial report, one never released to the public but passed around in shadow networks of researchers, archivists, and fringe academics, a conclusion was offered, not in language, but in a question. What if Travis Decker didn't disappear into the woods? What if he became the woods? The question was metaphorical, yes, but also terrifyingly literal to those who had been out there. Something about the forest near Listening Hill had changed since 2025. The trees grew in tighter spirals. The paths wound differently each time they were walked. People described an overwhelming sensation of being watched, by something that understood them completely. Something that was waiting. Not to harm them. Not to kill them. But to bring them into the story. Because once you entered it, you never truly left. And that was the end of the Decker case, not with an arrest or confession, but with a transformation. Of the land. Of memory. Of reality. The spiral was closed. But only for now. If Travis Decker is alive, he carries the darkest burden any father ever could. But if he's dead, then something else took his place that night in the woods. And maybe, it's still out there. This has been Mr. DarXnights. Don't forget to subscribe if you're brave enough to hear more disturbing stories that don't let you sleep. Until next time, keep your doors locked, and never ignore a whisper in the trees.